on. Okay. The line has been pressed. Thank you, Senator. Okay, this is Senate Finance, Thursday, January 23rd. And today we've invited Megan Roy, who is chairing the Commission on the Future of Public Education in Vermont. And come on up, Megan. I know this commission has been meeting since July regularly. And since we now have the governor's proposal on the table, and we know that the legislature is probably going to do something, we thought have Megan give us an update as to what they've done and what they're planning to do. I am on the commission and the steering committee and the finance subcommittee. This committee really, we did the subcommittee, but we had it as a separate standing work group, and let the education committee do any work on the substance of the commission. So we didn't do a lot in the formation of it, but I thought I'd give Megan a chance to tell us, because there's been a substantial amount of work that's been done over the summer. So,
all right. Great. Thanks, Senator Cummings. Thanks for having me, everyone. Again, I'm Megan Roy. My regular job, I coordinate the school leadership program at St. Michael's College. I was a superintendent very recently and special ed administrator for a long time. So I've spent most of my time in Vermont in public ed. And before I kick off, I'm going to give you a summary of the preliminary findings and sort of what we have done so far. I will start and end in the same way. And that is just to say, it's true that to some extent the ground is shifting underneath the work of the commission, and the question that we are trying to answer ourselves and also invite the legislature to answer for us, and I'll talk more about that, but is how can the commission best serve the legislature as they do this work? And the answer to that question about how we can best serve may be different than it was when the commission was convened. And so again, I'll sort of talk about that in the context of recommendations that the commission has made. And this is what I had intended to do, is just sort of share what is the commission, how you know enough about how it was convened, but who's on it, how have we organized our work. Preliminary findings, I will probably go a little bit quickly through that part because I think at this point, the findings are pretty well understood by folks, but I will go through those. And then I'll just have a conversation about the two recommendations, one of which is to come back to that question of affirming the purpose of the commission moving forward. So please interrupt me if you have questions. There should be time at the end. To a large extent, you know this, we were convened after Act 183 went into effect, and we were convened with a very lofty charge, which is to study the provision of education and make recommendations for a statewide system. And this is language from the law, but afforded substantially equal educational opportunities in an efficient, sustainable, and stable education system. It is an enormous charge, and that's one of the things that is relevant to what should we be spending our time on in a way that's going to support your work moving forward. But make no mistake, the commission was convened because of the sort of intractable challenge that Vermont is in right now around what is the education we're trying to provide for all students, and how do we provide that in a way that's equitable but also sustainable for the state. This is the membership that is on the commission. Most are designees or appointees from various not just education organizations, but I am here as a former chair of the Census-Based Funding Advisory Group, and attempting to chair. There's a lot of different perspectives on the commission, which I think is the intent, but this is who serves. And you do have access to the slides, so that's why I'm going to go relatively quickly. We started meeting, as Senator Cummings said, on July 15th. focus in the beginning was to develop a work plan and a communication and engagement plan, which I will talk about. And I would say most of our energy was devoted to this idea of preliminary findings and short-term cost containment recommendations. We were required to submit a report in December, which you received. Now we turn our attention to how do we organize ourselves to complete the rest of the charge. We will need to provide a final report in December of 2025 that includes legislative language proposals. This is all as is currently written in the law. We will need to have a more formal public comment period with any recommendations that we make. And we are deeply committed to engagement along the way. And we cease to exist in December of this coming year. I think it's at this point pretty well understood that these three policy areas are where the work centers. We knew that we needed to take the laundry list of policy items in the law that we're asked to address and organize them some way as a commission. That was partially so that we would know how to get the work done, but it also became clear that these areas are the three main bodies that we have to take into consideration. So we know that we need to look at our education finance system. I'm going to talk a little bit about why that is not just the cost. It's also the cost. It's how we raise the money. It's how we use the education fund. We know that education governance, resources, and administration is relevant. That is both the role and function of the state board and the agency of education, but it's also Vermont's tradition of local control and decision-making, and then physical size and footprint of the education system. So we have grouped our work around those things and acknowledge that they all intersect. And in fact, one of our biggest findings is that they intersect and the solution does not lie in any one of them. We also needed to develop a set of guiding principles. So if we are making decisions and if we are to attempt to have commonality as a commission, we needed to agree on what would we hold up any recommendation against. The first is more of an acknowledgement than it is a principle, and it is just that in Vermont, the state has authority and responsibility for education, and we have a tradition of local governance and decision-making, and those two things are at tension. The other three really are principles. We are committed to decision-making that centers equity. We don't attempt to define equity, but we have the core understanding that equity does not mean equal, that if we make decisions related to equity, they are differentiated by need. And we also talk about equity, not just in terms of inputs and what students have access to, but also outputs and outcomes. So that is how we sort of operationalize equity. Quality is a guiding principle. We know that all Vermont students in the public education system need to be afforded high quality opportunity. And that's language from state board rule. And sustainability and affordability. We wouldn't be here to talk about this if this was not a concern in Vermont. So in order to have this quality education, we need it to be affordable. When we began, we organized ourselves in subcommittees. Two of these subcommittees are defined in the law. The steering group, those 6 members are named, 2 by the House, 2 by the Senate, and 2 by the administration. That steering group named the Education Finance Subcommittee. There is one non-commission appointee. It's the only committee that is allowed to have a non-commission member. I would say this commission has more specificity in it about how it will run than most commissions. The middle subcommittee is one that the commission itself decided to convene, which is a communication and engagement subcommittee. And that is because as much as the law with good intention try to make the makeup of the commission broad, we don't believe we represent everyone in the state demographically or just from perspective. And so being able to engage the state in this work is really important. So we have a subcommittee. I will talk a little bit about related to sort of the shifting sands. We have decided to function in the short term as a full commission and suspend subcommittee meetings because all of the work is intersected. It does not necessarily mean that these committees won't be picked back up again, but for the foreseeable future, instead of having a full commission meeting and a subcommittee meeting per month, they are 2 full commission meetings per month. I'll talk more about that. This is what we mean by communication and engagement. Obviously, there's an information sharing component. Vermont system is really complex. And in order to be engaged, the public needs to be informed. We want to spend some time listening. And this partner and influence piece is really important. It's frustrating for folks to be asked their opinion and then have that opinion not be used. So because of this, the commission has secured a contract with an equitable community engagement consultant. They're called Afton Partners. We had our first preliminary meeting this week, actually. They'll be joining us at our February 3rd meeting. And we really want them to design a really deep and expansive way of engaging the public. And that is really relevant to one of our recommendations moving forward, because we think we can play a really important role for the legislature. Even if we are not generating, but reacting to recommendations, we can use the infrastructure in the commission for that. So I'm going to go through preliminary findings. As I said, I'm going to kind of go quickly because I think at this point we've talked enough about this. Not just we, frankly, but the Agency of Education and others as well. Vermont has a really complex context, right? That's pretty well known. There's overall affordability challenges in Vermont, and education is not unique to that. So some of our challenges are just like the challenges in other sectors. We do, though, feel pretty strongly as a commission that the cost and tax impact is not solely an issue of education spending. It's also related to how we deliver education, and then how we deliver education is related to governance and decision making. And so it's really difficult to isolate any one thing. And in the public and in the media, there can be this, well, if you only could just do this, or if you could only just spend less, and it is more complicated than that. That is actually a finding of the commission. And that sort of leads to the third bullet, which is delivery models impact quality, and they're determined locally. And yet our system is shared across the state. So this is sort of a finding in and of itself. We think it's really important for those engaged, the decision makers, which is you, are really clear about how these 3 things intersect. So I won't sort of repeat that. We sort of put a call to action out in our report. We have a collective responsibility to provide education for our youth, and a collective responsibility to resolve the issues that we have. And in order to do this, it's really going to involve transformational change in all of these areas. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, there's a lot of words in the slide, you can read them later. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the process that the commission used to develop and explore policies. Again, as I said, our focus, once we were organized, was on what we were going to recommend, to the extent that we could recommend anything, by December. We are committed to the use of data. We have largely relied on the Agency of Education for the data in the short term, partially because they are engaged in a process that runs very parallel to the work of the commission. And that is something that we have acknowledged, and it's related to, and so if that is true, how best can we serve this work moving forward? There have been questions raised about data. Some of those questions have been presented, and the agency has been pretty responsive in looking at those and putting back out data. And there's still questions, and there's still pieces of data that are missing. That made it challenging to make recommendations, and I'll talk about that related to our timeline. But the themes of the data, the themes are consistent across very high level themes, meaning we're pretty unique in Vermont with how we organize and fund our education system. We tend to be smaller. We tend to be more highly staffed. And that results in higher per pupil costs. Those are relatively unchanged things. Even as when you go down a few layers, there's always more complexity, but those are pretty consistent. So our policy consideration, we realized pretty quickly, requires a pretty deep amount of data. The devil is in the details. Over the course of the work, primarily within the Education Finance Subcommittee, and Senator Cummings, you can feel free to jump in and expand if at any point, but that subcommittee generated from within, from public comment, and quite frankly, ideas that have existed in Vermont for a long time, and have a working document that is linked in the report. There was actually quite a bit of debate amongst the commission about whether to include that working document, because it's not a recommendations document. It is a laundry list of potential policy actions, some of which actually conflict with each other. But it was useful work because as you generate suggestions, you also generate, here's what we would need to know about each one of these things to know if these are a good idea or not.
It was a computer brainstorming thing done anonymously, similar to everybody write it and stick your idea on the board. And the purpose was to generate everything that anybody had heard.
Right.
That was out there.
And we've had folks acknowledge, but this was said in public comment and it's not in the document yet. And that's because it's a working document. And I think to some extent, if the commission were continuing exactly on the path that it was at, it would be picking back up that document and starting to vet it and starting to say, these things really aren't viable, for whatever reason. And so that's sort of how they undertook their work. And this next slide, I think. Yeah, we were limited by our time frame. I mean, I think in some ways, the original purpose of the commission and its 18-month tenure to take these lofty policy areas was the right timeline, and a 6-month timeline to try to say, yeah, but could you give us something to work with this session? It recognizes why we were asked to do that, and it was really difficult. So that is why what is in the preliminary report is a status update. We also know the public school budget development process isn't just nearing conclusion. Many school boards have already adopted their budgets for FY26. That doesn't mean that they haven't been paying close attention to this and working really hard. I can say that from my non-commission hat. Working really hard to take action on reducing spending. But again, that's only one lever, and that's really challenging. And short-term cost containment strategies are necessary, but they're not sufficient. So the large-scale change that will be required to really look at this and have impact long-term will take time. So that brings me to kind of the question that I started with. So the commission was established in good faith with this lofty charge and the idea that bringing all these folks together would help round out the ability of the legislature to understand the whole and make recommendations. But we're pretty keenly aware, we were aware in December that there is a sense of urgency, and that is even more clear now. So we need to figure out, the commission was convened to generate recommendations. I think the legislature needs to think about, are you still asking us to generate recommendations? Are you asking us to react to recommendations based on what you tell us? Is it a combination of the two? There's lots of other policy areas in the Act that we're asked to look at that are not specifically related. So for example, governance function, things like that. We do believe that we are uniquely suited to be able to engage the public and do a deep analysis of the work, and that we can play a role. But we think we need to, at least we will on our own, prioritize our work. And the legislature may need to refine, focus, give us some direction. Because, I mean, just as an anecdote, as I'm planning for our second phase of work plan development, and just writing down every individual policy area in the law is about 5 pages. That's just here's what we're asked to make recommendations on. So we're going to have to prioritize our work. We want to be useful. We think we can be useful. And we are open to the legislature helping direct us. But I would also say it's really important that the legislature affirm and support the commission in whatever role you are asking us to do, because there is a fear on the part of the commission of doing work over here, but the real work's happening over here. And that's not useful for anyone. It's not useful for folks that could benefit from the input the commission can bring, and it's frankly not useful for the commission itself. So if the commission is going to continue to do its work, it's actually pretty important that the legislature say, yes, we have this commission. Yes, we've asked them to do this work, and here it is. And the commission understands that you might adjust what you ask us to do, and that's okay. But affirming it one way or the other is really important. So that's one of our, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Megan. Quick couple questions. One, you sunset in December, it's almost February. It sounds like there's an ask for more clarity for your work between now and next December, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, that was my first question. You want to answer? Sorry.
Well, I wonder if I give you an update as to where we are now and may answer the question.
Okay.
So I'll pause on answering it, but you answer the question.
My other one was just about this, because I really like the findings of the finance subcommittee. But it sounds like you're not going to be meeting as a subcommittee again. You also want to vet this some more. When do you have a sense of time in terms of timeline when this might be more refined?
Yeah, that's a great question. Let me get through this next
Okay.
too, because at the end, I'll talk about what we're doing now and sort of how we think we're going to organize ourselves, which is related to that.
Okay, so thank you.
We also made a recommendation that it's really important to continue to prioritize engagement in this process. The law calls out specific groups that we need to talk with. There are more groups that need to be involved. One of the things that we are doing is taking each policy area and saying to ourselves, what information do we need about this? Who else needs to be involved in this decision? And how do we prioritize that? We have a communication and engagement consultant. I am excited and optimistic about the support that they can bring to the commission. And I think that can be helpful for the legislature. So we also recognize that we are a separate body from the Agency of Education. There has been confusion about the two roles because a lot of what the agency has been convening feels an awful lot like what we are doing. Community engagement sessions, data collection, recommendations. We have benefited from some of the information that the agency has collected. We've also gotten criticism for using just the agency's information. My opinion as chair is that our job is to look at all information that comes in. And part of how you critically analyze information is to critically analyze it. And so we have a structure that could be really beneficial to this work. And regardless of whether the legislature chooses to use our structure or another one, our recommendation is you really need to engage the public. And I think that is probably more clear now after the proposal than ever before. It's really important that Vermonters be able to weigh in on some of those things. Those are our recommendations. So our next steps really are at our February 3rd meeting, we will hear from our communication and engagement consultants, and we will go through the laundry list of priorities, one of which is the sort of finance related proposals. Actually, some of those are governance. I think all three areas are represented in there. And we will go through a process to say, how will we work from February 3rd until December to be able to deliver on what we're being asked to deliver on. That's going to require prioritization. There's going to be some of those policy consideration areas that we on our own decide. I don't think that we have the capacity to do this. We think these ones are more important. As I said, if the legislature chooses to direct that, we will. Our hope is to be supportive and useful. So we would respond if there was prioritization. Our original cadence, absent of proposals that come through the legislature, was to pick back up that document, say, what do we know about these issues? What do we still need to gather, and start to vet them, and then be able to come back with here's viable recommendations or not. I think it's a fair question for us to ask, is that still a useful task? Or is the legislature choosing to focus on the proposals included in the administration's proposal? And if so, the commission can be helpful in that. Or is the legislature wanting us to continue to be broad and surface other proposals? To some extent, we need you to tell us that. You've convened us, not you specifically, but the body has convened the commission. And as I said, we will prioritize, and we will also be responsive to priorities given to us, if that is what is chosen. So that's what I have to share. I'm happy to answer questions.
Okay. We do need to talk about what we see you doing. And we are, I think next week, my plan is we're going to be looking at, we had our first briefing on the governor's proposal. There's some pretty broad areas and just a great lack of detail. So we're still working on what is it. We're not going to have a lot of time to do public engagement. And you have, as members of the commission, most of what's called the education establishment, but the people who are representing, at least the people who are boots on the ground. So that kind of feedback circle would be helpful to us as we work through it. I doubt that we're going to get everything in place before we go home, probably the end of June. Unless we get more in place than I think we might. But it is, you know, as the commission has figured out, it is a huge task. And every task needs to make sure that people you're impacting, at least the majority of them, are willing to go along. And so that public engagement is going to be very important. And I think you are uniquely set up. I'm not sure how, you know, because the commission is, we've been to St. Albans, we've been to Randolph. I missed the one, and I'm going to miss February 3rd because the surgery that got put off is on February 3rd. I missed one meeting because my husband was supposed to have surgery and I sent him home.
Well, related to that, I didn't sort of overview that part of it. The commission is required to meet in every county. So we have met in 4 counties so far. And we'll continue to do that. We have had a session in each county, and we think we will have even better sessions, frankly, with the support of an engagement consultant.
Don't beat us as well as Randolph.
They do win, yes. We were at the tech center and
They may be doing a bistro in New York. That was anticipating tater tots and grilled cheese. We got the 4-course dinner starting with steak tips. So I was impressed with the culinary students down there. But yeah, so I think, but it's going to be opening and I think probably Representative Conlon was more involved in the original creation concept of the commission. And so it'll be on us at some point to talk with amongst our 2 bodies and at least 4 committees,
right,
to figure out what we want to do.
I also want to talk a little bit about the, so if we think differently about our role, and our role being to surface issues either from our perspectives on the commission or from the perspectives that we gather in reaction, this question of sort of consensus and can the commission land on a recommendation? That's an open question for things as complicated as this. But if we think differently about our charge, then our charge is less about getting all 13 people to vote yes on something and more to say, these 13 people believe you all need to be really thoughtful about X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
So that it is about them reacting to things. And it doesn't have to be just reacting to what's been put on the table from the administration. There may be other ideas that come out of the legislature. Exactly. And so, and I think that's important because, you know, that question has been raised to me as chair. Can you get them all to agree? And I don't know that the answer to that question would be yes for issues as complex as this. But again, if we think differently about what we could do, that is less important. If it happens, that's great. There would be some weight behind that. But it is also instructive to be able to say, from the perspective of a school board member, or from the perspective of someone related to independent schools, or, you know, pick one of them. Here are the things that you need to think about. If, you know, the perspective of folks from rural school districts, here are the things to think about. That is still useful. And again, it goes on. We also need the legislature to elevate and acknowledge the work if we're going to continue to do it, because the commission's a little bit absent from the conversation. And that's fine. We don't need to be in the forefront, but we do, if the work of those 13 people is going to be worthwhile, you know, the legislature needs to say that.
They've got busy jobs. They've got things to do other than meet for, right, we're not gonna pay any attention. Okay, got Sandra back. And then
I'm gonna be a little outside the box here. I think it would be the best thing if the commission disbanded.
You're not the only one to have.
Yeah, I mean, these members on here, I know every one of them, they all have a very, very valuable perspective. And when this bill starts moving through, they are all gonna come in individually to share their perspective with the committees of jurisdiction. And I think we're gonna get it all. I don't know if the commission could get all 13 of them to believe the same thing, that commission would tell us the same thing they're telling us when they're in committee. So I don't know. I mean, I'm just not sure what, you know, to have a parallel group monitoring, checking work. That's not something we would normally do in a legislative process. And so I don't know, I'm kind of wondering if the commission still needs to keep going.
I think that's why that recommendation of affirm the purpose is put out there. I would say that members of the commission believe it should remain because there needs to be, this is the perspective of the commission. And again, the legislature convened us. They can also unconvene us, to disband us. And we know that. It's why we're asking for clarity, frankly, but absent clarity and absent action, we're moving forward and we're trying to do that in a way that's useful. I think there is perspective that I've heard as chair just through, you know, communication and correspondence. There are some folks who really want it as a body that they perceive as neutral. I mean, so that's it. So that is why the commission is not coming to you and saying, we think you should disband us. We are coming to you and saying, we think the legislature needs to clarify what it is. And if not, here's how we are clarifying our, that's sort of where we are now.
I think when you come in here and you are the representative X organization, then you have to present as strongly as possible the viewpoint of that organization. And I think most of them have sent the commission letters making their viewpoint clear. When you say to someone, we're going to make a decision, the legislature is going to make a decision, and I've done it in this committee, you'll go to the hall and work out what you can live with. You're going to like that a lot better than what we decide. Apps, you know, it's my way or the highway. You get 3 or 4 people in here and that's it. if they can go out amongst themselves, which is really what the commission said, and they can come in and say, well, we're holding our noses, we don't really love it, but we could live with this, or we could live with this if you do that. That is frequently been a better way to reach consensus, or at least the least objectionable solution, because I think it's pretty clear that the legislature is not going home until something is done. I think we're quite clear, given our number, that we probably won't have a budget until we have an agreement as to at least the direction we're going in. And this committee at least not only has this, but we have the low healthcare affordability crisis. So we're going to be very busy. And the more those groups can talk together and say, yeah, we could live with that, or have you considered this? The more eyes on this, the better. I'm planning next week to pretty much go through each section of the governor's proposal and understand what it is, understand what we don't know, understand information we need in order to even start to talk about it. And that's probably going to take us several weeks to where we have our minds or hands around it. And a third set of eyes would be helpful.
Proposal from yesterday.
There's, what have I got there? Yeah, I mean, what are we doing with incomes? How are you setting that deduction? How are you raising the money? What do you mean by weights? What weights are you including or not including, or are they the same? Just a lot of things that are very broad in the presentation that Joint Fiscal is still working to understand enough of the proposals so they can help us understand the questions or the information we need in order to make a decision. So we are at the 5,000 foot level right now too. So any help, but we will probably need to sit down with the 4 committees who did this deed, which it came to us whole cloth from the House, I think mostly education, but came on the yield bill from Ways and Means. We sent it to education for vetting. And so those 4 committees are going to have to sit down and have a talk about what would be the most useful, or is there a useful purpose for the commission.
Hi, Megan. Hi, Ruth Hardy. I guess my question is sort of playing off of what Senator Beck said and I think I heard you say that the commission does think it should continue, but do you think it should continue, or do you think it has served its purpose and needs to sort of go away now that there's a proposal on the table?
It's a good question, and I hope I can clarify. We do believe we could serve a purpose.
Okay.
It is not necessarily the generation of recommendations, it is the vetting and reacting to. We do think we should serve a purpose, and if the legislature does not agree, they should disband us.
Okay.
Because otherwise we are sort of spinning our wheels. So that is how I would clarify those. Okay. The answer is yes, we think we could serve this big, huge lift that you are about to undertake, because these are big changes. We think we could be helpful. And if you don't agree, you should tell us.
Okay. That's helpful. That clarity is helpful. I wonder from your perspective, how you see that vetting happening while we're simultaneously vetting and the Agency of Education is still working out the details. So logistically, over the next few months, how would you see that working? Would you meet and come back and report to us? Would you? Yeah, how do you
Yeah.
see it working?
Well, for one thing, we have not existed during your session until now, right?
Yeah.
So we have no cadence that has been established about how we would do that. And I think we would need to develop one, whether that is a regular, and you all would have to tell us which committee, but a regular briefing after every meeting, whatever. So we would have to establish a cadence with the legislature. I also think, and this is just, interestingly, the concept of, let's just say, the 5 district, maybe the 5 hasn't been floated, but the idea of the building has been floated. It's in the working document. So the things that have been proposed are not necessarily new things. They're coalesced, right? So and there's a significant amount of, okay, so if you are going to do this, here are all the things that you should consider that we could do. The position of the commission is that there needs to be that level of scrutiny. So we would develop a work plan to be able to react to those things in real time. That's part of what we're going to do on February 3rd, whether we have direction from that's different or not.
Mhm. Well, that is helpful to hear, because I mean, I do think that there's a lot that needs to be talked about. I mean, I have 8 billion questions, and I want to hear what other people think, including members of the commission and the organizations and perspectives you all represent on the commission. I think it would just be really important, and I don't think we can define this unless we do it in the Budget Adjustment Act. It's going to be hard to define your role before we're in the process.
Correct.
So it might be just a wink and a nod, kind of like,
Absolutely.
hey, can you do this stuff
Yeah.
for us? The chairs ask,
Yes.
and, you go and do it. I do think, I mean, my sort of gut reaction was not dissimilar to yours. I'm like, hey, why are they still existing? But I also think that if we can put you to good use, that makes our work more effective and efficient. Because I don't think it's going to do us any good to pass something that isn't fully vetted that comes out of here. And then we go out in, June, and people are like, why didn't you ask this question? Why are you doing this thing? And if we are able to be like, well, we have this commission that represents all these organizations who helped us, that would be helpful. So that's one thing. And then the second is the PR, or public engagement, I guess, PE, public engagement. Do you think that would be a helpful role for you to play in addition to the vetting role? And if so, how would you do that? Because I agree, it's going to be hard for us to do the public engagement aside from our own individual meetings with constituents.
Yep. Well, 2 things. One, the focus on engagement is also because, not unlike probably members of the legislature themselves, we are criticized by whether or not we fully represent all of Vermont. And so the bringing in more voices with people who are experts and bringing in voices that aren't usually at the table, that was one of the reasons we convened. The other reason we want that level of expertise is that we know that an engagement session that we had in October that was very broad. What do you value about Vermont education? What do you want to make sure stays? That kind of information session is not going to be as useful now that there are ideas on the table. Instead, the engagement sessions need to be, hey, this idea is on the table. What's the input? And we need experts to be able to say, here are some specific people or groups or areas of the state that you should be even more engaged with on this particular issue. We need some expertise to tell us that. So it's a long way of saying, I think the reason we have these consultants is so that we can be pretty reactive and responsive to what kind of engagement is helpful. Even the engagement that starts, say, in February, March, is going to be different from engagement that happens after the session is over,
Mhm.
right? There, even when action is taken in the session, there's going to be more. So I think the goal with having the engagement is so that it can be pretty nimble.
And who's your consultant that you?
Afton Partners. I did not bring with me sort of their one pager or blurb. I'd be happy to forward that. They are coming to the February 3rd meeting, and
Okay,
I think
are they
that's
a
that.
Vermont firm?
They are not. They're out just outside of DC.
Okay,
I've got Martine and Tom, I don't think I saw. Them. And
Yeah,
then,
for now.
okay.
I don't think I started with a thank you for your work. Really great. And just wanna, I know, I
Just making,
appreciate you.
when I come out of the meetings, it feels like gibberish and somehow makes it
Yeah,
sound
yeah.
like English.
Thank you so
And
much.
logical.
Thank you very much.
Great respect for your skill.
Yeah, it's huge. I also wanted to say that just to sort of piggyback on some of what's said, at least I can't speak for the entire legislature, but the way I see it right now is we've sort of asked the governor to propose a new system, which he's doing. But I don't know anything. Like I haven't been told, I don't know about everyone else, but I only know what I was shown yesterday. So and this is, I was vice chair of Ed for the last 2 years, and I'm still sitting in a position of like, I don't know what's happening other than that presentation yesterday. So it's hard for me to even think about helping you and guiding you in your work when I don't know what direction we're going in. And I'm sure other legislators feel that way. But to be continued, obviously, maybe as things get come to light and get fleshed out, we'll be able to give you more direction. I certainly hope so. But I guess I just want to say I watched some of your meetings, or one or two, and I was so impressed with the public that did attend. And I was impressed with how knowledgeable they were and how passionate, and they had so many great suggestions and observations about the system. So I found that really interesting. I was not expecting that. I also just want to say one of the things I really like about your group is that it is so diverse. There are so many perspectives, so many different interests in that group of people. And, that's how work gets done, right? When lots of different viewpoints come together and say, how are we going to fix this? And we've been doing things the same for a long, long time. And obviously the time has come to make some bold changes. And the only way we can do that is if we all come together, in my perspective. So I just wanted to say thank you for that. It's really much appreciated. And when I know more, I will definitely start thinking about how I can best direct you for the next few months. 'Cause that's really what it's going to be.
No, I appreciate that. And one thing I would say, I know that wasn't really a question, but I would say that directing us could just mean either pointing to certain of the asks and saying in the law and saying these are more important than the others, or we're already engaged on these particular elements, and so we don't need you focusing on those. Instead, we really need you to do a deep dive into. So sometimes the direction doesn't necessarily require like it doesn't have to be that specific, I think. And then again, it does go back to for us, it's one or the other. And we're all grown up professionals who this isn't our job. So if the decision is not to convene, those of us who want to stay engaged in the process will absolutely stay engaged. But clarity is important because the commission is either sort of silent and not referenced in the ether, or it's referenced and it's sort of glanced at as like, what is this commission? They're so slow. So we really do need someone to elevate the commission, and it needs to be the legislature, because if no one is placing value in that structure, then it shouldn't exist, because there's people sitting on there dedicating time to it.
And giving significant time.
Yeah.
So pick up on that point, and I would say I see two options that have been presented, but I'd almost gravitate towards a third as some guidance. So one, you can keep going as you are. I don't think that makes sense right now. There's two, completely disband, just shut down, and drop away flag. I don't think that's necessary, but what I do think is if I was on your committee, I'd want to suspend or pause. I think something's going to change at the end of the session, and I think that group and that composition will, I believe, I bet, whatever does come out of this legislature will want to factor in how either that commission in its current form or in a new form might spend some of the time, I'm guessing after June.
Implementation. Yeah.
So I would want to spin your wheels a lot between now and really May, if not June, because time, consultant resources, they're scarce. And so I would not disband. I would not continue. I would sort of pause. That's where I would be.
I think we're gonna be the ones
Yeah.
that have to give instruction.
I think, I like the way Senator Shipman's thinking. I would be very uncomfortable with the idea of you all continue your work if you agree with what we're doing here, and if you don't, I would almost feel like, comparisons to Putin or something. I would be very uncomfortable with that type of arrangement, that your continued work and existence is contingent on agreement with whatever this bill is, it's gonna be going through. That's what I thought.
Yeah, I don't think it's.
Nobody's got
contingent
that.
on agreement.
No.
I think.
The
we've
point we
gotta-
made where you said that you would disband this at some, you could always disband this, and if.
Yeah.
If, tell me what you.
The way
heard, because I don't think that I.
The way I heard it was, is that if you were able to stay behind us and stay behind this vehicle, whatever it is, then we would continue to work, but if not, we'd have to disband.
No.
Is that not what you meant?
No, and I'm sorry if I wasn't
Yeah.
clear. What I mean is, if the legislature still thinks this body, is important to react to any proposal. So let's say the administration hadn't put a proposal on the table, the legislature is going to generate proposals, and we would have had a role in that, right? Like, the commission was convened to be generative, to generate the ideas.
Yeah.
And the legislature is going to generate ideas, and our job was always going to be both generating and reacting to. So in some ways, that's not different. We're just acknowledging that there is urgency here. And my clarification about the disbanding is not because we do what's been proposed. It's simply, if you have chosen a different way as a legislature to do the work, then we should be disbanded. That's all. I didn't mean to tie our existence to the support or lack of support of anything that's been proposed, because I don't think we're there yet, frankly.
No, we have one idea that's been put on the table. I think anyone that's worked with this administration over a number of years is pleasantly surprised that it is such a detailed and, sizable change. It's a long way from the very small ideas we've gotten in the past. We're still trying to get our heads around it. There will, I'm sure, be bills in here with other ideas. This committee may generate other ideas. I'm pretty sure Ways and Means will generate other ideas. Or we will start with this base and build. But no matter what we do, it's going to require that the folks out there follow, or we're back here starting at square one again, or somebody else is. And so to have that communications and feedback from interest groups, they represent a specific group of people, but also to have that conduit to the public where information can be dispersed. I'm surprised that my emails are relatively empty today.
Yeah.
But there hasn't been a lot of press coverage. But we have a group of regular followers who come in do public education. And most of them are saying, I don't care what you do, don't touch us, don't touch our schools, don't touch my organization. And The reason that first thing is there is the first challenge was, well, you're violating the Constitution if you even think about closing a rural school. So we got a legal
Yeah.
opinion as to who has the power to do that.
I would also say this is kind of related to, your mechanism for, even anything, changing our charge, disbanding as your mechanism also takes time because it would need to,
Yes.
right? So know that just functionally, because I had this conversation with House Ed and House Ways and Means, and I think I'll be at Senate Ed next week. I report back, hey, some ideas were put out about what the role of the commission could be. It's been raised that we pause, it's been raised that we don't like, so what you share is going to come back to the commission. And that sort of like, we can adjust our work based on what we're hearing. What I don't know, because I don't speak for the whole commission, I'm trying to represent them, but I don't want to make up an answer. I wonder how the commission would feel about pausing, because then if nothing happened, then we only have 6 months to deliver on this enormous charge.
We could
So-
extend that deadline.
Exactly. Well, yeah, exactly. So I'm just saying that,
We can move the deadline.
right, there is still a way to sort of influence the work, and we are welcoming that. Obviously, if we got 4 different suggestions for how to direct our work from 4 different committees, then we would talk
Now,
about
we
that.
owe
and
it
figure
to
out.
you to
Yeah,
talk together and come up with,
yeah, that would be helpful.
yes,
I would also
unified.
say that, the idea, I'm talking as if that there has been a decision to no longer generate new ideas. There hasn't been. There's just an acknowledgement that there's big ideas on the table that require some vetting. But if there starts to circle around some of the things in that proposal document that the legislature would like us to be reacting to, again, with like developing some way of connecting, we would be willing to do that.
We may know the number by the end of next week, maybe generate questions.
Yes.
Well, even within the proposal that's on the table, there are still ideas that need to be vetted and included, because there are lots of things, what would we do about X, Y, and Z,
Correct.
even within that big proposal, because our, any education system at this point is so complicated. There's so many different kinds of students, so many different programs, so
Yep.
many different types of school districts and
Collective bargaining cycles.
yes, exactly.
Yeah,
all
There's
of those
so
things.
many different things. So I think that
Yep.
one option is generating ideas that are compatible or can work within the larger framework of
Yep.
what's on the table. Because we're not going to be able to get to all those details, I don't think, in this session, and we might have to come back next session and work out some of the details. And if you're generating them, I think collective bargaining is a really great, a great example.
Yeah.
I think that there on your list were a couple things, and that's sort of in the ether of what do we do about it.
Yep.
So I think that those kinds of things could also be really useful, because I think it's best for us to focus on some of the big picture systemic changes, broadly speaking, and then the details will have the subcategories come later.
I think starting out now, a list of questions we need to get answers to. That's my goal to develop, and this committee's going to be looking mostly at the numbers. What numbers? How are they going to work? Who are we going to tax? How much is it going to cost? But it's like last year when we were dealing with school budgets. I don't think any of us realized that in the contract, it says if you're going to lay anyone off, you have to send out a RIF notice by date certain.
Right.
And we were getting over that date certain. So,
Everybody who's been on the school board knows that.
I know, but most of us don't. And so those, how are you going to do this within that constraint? There is my understanding, and some of us have had some briefings, is, I know they've laid it out as a problem, is our whole budget cycle is dysfunctional. And it got brought up again yesterday. I'm not clear as to what the new budget cycle they're proposing is. I suppose you can look at the rest of the country and see what they do, because we seem to be going towards a more national model. But that, you know, by the time you get the information, your budgets are done, and by the time you vote them, you don't know what we're doing, so you don't.
Right. Well, our budget cycle is built around the idea that the local builds the budget.
Right,
Many other states, that's not how it
Yeah.
is. Many other states, we're told what to do, and then the budget cycle becomes, how are you going to spend it? And you're developing a spending plan, not a budget.
and that's my understanding of what the governor's proposal has. That the big school board, representing all the littler school boards, will figure out the payment, and this is, I think they're using child-centered, or but a foundation that,
Well, a
It's
foundation
much-
formula would cause a decision to be made about what then would a community vote on.
right,
And if there's a mechanism for exceeding, then there would be a vote, but some states there isn't a budget vote because the money is generated. Right, so it's a fundamental change,
oh, it is.
a whole lot of things.
It is a
Yeah.
huge change. I give the governor credit for taking the risk to put it forward, because nobody's going to like all of it. Some people are going to hate lots of it. But any of us that were here last year knows that we are not on sustainable footing, and we're in the same place with healthcare. And healthcare is a driving cost lead cost driver in education spending. There's also a proposal to do a statewide teacher's salary and elevate the salaries of teachers in poorer communities so they can afford to live there or desire, to stay there. But all those details are still very vague.
Yeah.
I think that if most teachers got all the supports that's in the PICUS recommendation, that things that should be in a foundation payment, that they would be very happy. All kinds of career development and time. I'm quite sure that the majority of teachers in the state don't get that much support. I mean, this would be a good thing for them. Senator Brock.
In the event that the commission were to stay around, what would be its reporting relationships?
I think we would need to create one, because right now, written in the law, the only next report we deliver is the final one in December, and I don't think that's very useful. So I think at minimum, it's a communication cadence similar to what I was saying.
But in terms of the commission, is the commission considered, based on what it's doing right now, an independent organization that doesn't report to anyone, doesn't report to the governor, doesn't report to the legislature?
It
Is there
reported
any-
to the General Assembly and
Okay.
not like a named committee.
Mhm. Yeah.
Previous committees or commissions report to a committee, and it's not specified.
But in this particular case, it may report to a committee, but who directs it? Anyone? Or is the commission entirely self-directed?
The commission is self-directed, other than it's defined
Mhm.
pretty lockstep about how we do it.
If the commission is self-directed and disagrees with the direction that those committees of jurisdiction of the legislature have established, and now we've subsequently voted and taken it forward, we create a potential conflict of interest.
My sense is that because our job is to generate recommendations for you all,
Mhm.
if there's a conflict, it simply is one or the other of us will disagree with, right? Like we could make recommendations that the legislature disagrees with, or the legislature could be moving forward on on a path that the commission doesn't agree with, in which case we would communicate that, but because it really is it's not a decision-making body.
Mhm.
And I guess the only clarity that I didn't think of until after, the steering group is written in as it's still self-managed, to your point, but it's their responsibility to direct the work of the whole, which really is just like an executive committee. It's not.
Once, assuming that the General Assembly decides this is the way that we're going to go towards next steps, would the General Assembly at that point, that direct or guide what you did, or could you continue to, in terms of your examination of how this was being done or working or planned, would you still have a role?
It's a good question. I guess one answer would be if as a commission, our consensus reaction to whatever the legislature was doing was one of disagreement,
Mhm.
we would say that.
Mhm.
Kind of ends there in a way, right? So we would state that. Would we ever decide to disband ourselves? I don't know. I guess what we would be doing is asking to be disbanded, which we're not doing right now, but I don't know. I
Well,
think the commission would have to,
Yeah, if there were a
react.
redefinition of the commission's
Yeah.
role, which might be an advisory role to the General Assembly in terms of legislation that the General Assembly passes during this particular session towards, you would assist in its implementation and
Yep.
provide recommendations for its proper implementation. I'm just concerned that we have this tendency to create advisory commissions who provide advice and guidance and reports on what we should do about education. And we've had, 38 or 39 of them. And and I'm concerned that I don't want to create another one. That said, I think that there needs to be guidance more than perhaps we have internal on what needs to be done when the legislature is not in session and as we're moving towards implementation. But at the same time, I don't want to create what essentially is a conflict or argument that the legislature has to come back and resolve. I just think about the corporate world. Nobody would operate like we do.
No.
A decision we made, this is what we're going to do. We've taken, we've got the consulting advice that have guided us and we've looked at the situation. This is what we're going to do and we're going to do it. The next thing though is at that point you have the evaluation of what's been done. In other words, a quick and ongoing process to look at whether or not what you did is working.
Right.
A commission would be of value, in this case, of assisting us. The auditor's office would be value in assisting us and others to guide, are we achieving what we intended to achieve and is what we plan to do working? And we need to start that on day one, not we'll go back 5 years later and determine through a sunset whether it's working.
Okay.
But again, as I hear the argument that we've been having, this is an argument of us doing something instead of talking about doing something.
There's the rub right there.
Well, I think this was pretty much a punt. The final thing was set up at 10 o'clock at night, along with the data privacy of last night of the session. And those of us who were not on the committee of conference didn't know. This committee did have reservations about the effectiveness of the commission. But no one has all power in this building, and it is the art of the possible, which means we don't always end up with the best solutions, but we are where we are. I think there is a role for the commission. I think we need to talk with the two committees that created it pretty much. And talk with them about what they're thinking. And then we need, in fairness, to give an answer to the commission. Because if we have no intention of listening to them at all, then let
It's in our
them enjoy their mornings and not spend them either at National Life or going cross-eyed on Zoom. And I have in my notes that I need to set up a meeting with Representative Kornheiser and we can get this in motion. Okay, Senator
My,
Yeah, you
Just-
were on that committee.
no, or Ways and Means I was on, yeah.
Yeah,
I thought you meant,
It came from House Ed.
yeah.
that's what I
And-
figured.
They worked on it for quite a while, actually, and then when Ways and Means punted on the funding formula
Yeah.
change, that's when they
Stuck in.
inserted it,
Stuff
yeah.
at it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that, kind of brings me to the point you just made about the commission and how it was last minute and thrown in there, whatever. The thing I worry about most is the commission meets, talks about, some kind of policy decision that the legislature's thrown out there. And you make a recommendation as a commission, say you come in, give your pitch on that, presentation on that. And then just in the everyday life of the stakeholders in that group, they start to come in and be like, no, we don't like that. We don't like that. We don't like that. And then we come back to you and say, hey, Megan, just curious, what was the vote out of that 13 people? Oh, it was 7-6. So it's the majority of the commission, but then you have all the
Yeah.
stakeholders in their everyday jobs
Yep.
come in. That's kind of the worry I have
Yeah.
about going
Yeah.
side by side, because they do have, that's their everyday job is to advocate for their
Advocate.
groups. Right.
And that's.
They're all coming in anyhow.
And
And that's, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I don't disagree.
Yeah.
At all, and it's why if we're to continue, it may be more helpful to say, here are the perspectives.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
instead of worrying so much about what was the vote, it would simply be, here's the list of considerations that you
Right.
need to think about.
Yeah. Have you-
And you're gonna have to decide whether or not getting that through the commission is the best way, or just letting those organizations advocate on their own.
Use them
Best way.
as
Yeah.
feedback and a conduit to the public.
Yep.
For feedback. I mean, the commission, we've got a map and it says this is where the school district is gonna be. I don't know where the mountains are in the middle of that. And I know there's some going down the middle. But where is, I always remember the guy from Head Start that came up from DC and couldn't figure why it took an hour for the bus to go 10 miles. Well, there's a mountain in the middle and it has to go around. We're in that position. We don't know
Right.
where the mountains are. We don't know where the dirt roads are that don't get plowed. And so that's we're gonna need that kind of contact with reality. Because we do get isolated up here under the dome, and generally you hear from people that have, only from people that have very strong feelings. And frequently it's a form letter of which they push forward to your legislator.
We've gotten those too.
Yeah.
As a commission. And I feel your pain only
Yeah.
this much, because I don't do it all the time.
But that's not necessarily the feeling of the general public. People that are on either side with very strong feelings tend to contact us, so they have a broader kind of. Okay, thank you, Megan.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Thank you for showing up.
We will do our best.
You have been, it has been a volume of work.
Yeah.
And just getting the groups to agree, just getting that group of brainstorming things sent over was painful. Yeah. All right, we have about 2 minutes. Jake is Jake in the waiting room. I said,
in the waiting room, yeah.
all right, well, we could stay at ease for 1 minute. Till we get tax, they're gonna talk about property valuation overview. We have time, we do have time.
Quick break.
Quick real quick. We have to have somebody come talk to us about the education policy package. I was hoping this would get Julia, but we got. We have a lot of fire on the avoidance of time. No problem. Working our way through step by step. Yeah. And it's
In business, you're just trying to maximize profits,
Yeah.
you know, there's so much more.
And you want to get on the business instead of.
How you doing?
Well,
are you?
Well,
anything, but you know, whatever would happen, we're going to go to the other side anyway.
yeah. I don't want to sit there and get another overview. Jake is here. I think you should, we thought you were sitting.
My wife is picking up my kid from
Oh.
school, so I can come in person.
So you don't have to zoom on
I don't have to do more.
from the car with the kid hanging over your shoulder. We got more cats than kids though, I think, in the days we were. Something about screens and cats. We all mourned when Pearson's cat had to be put down. He was a regular attendee of this committee.
My cat doesn't get on the screen so much when I'm doing work, but my kid loves to dominate it.
Oh, yeah. You see the ad, mother, the kids try, the kid is peeking over her shoulder, she's got the coffee cup.
Yeah.
Yeah, Zoom had its interesting parts. I think the issue with Pearson's cat was that the cat slept in the computer chair. Pearson threw him. What he was doing. We met Don. There were some interesting things in the Zoom. We're taking about a second. Jill, we're still live. We're still live and Jill is not here yet.
She's coming.
So we are catching our breath after. Here for the Commission on Future
You're
Policy.
not talking about this, Jay, that's tomorrow.
That's tomorrow, yeah.
And I am supposed to be next door in a meeting at 4:15, but I think we may. I don't dare move that vote. Did you get a response?
I did, I
to
sent-
the-
Do you want me to print out hard copies or can I just post it out?
However you want, hard copy might be easier. I think.
Yeah, I think so.
And one of the, and I guess one of the questions would be, does it contain? I don't think it contains sufficiently personal information about the individual that posting it would present a problem.
Okay.
So, again, part of disclosure, you know, the normal disclosure, financial disclosures.
Yeah, all right.
Present.
Yeah, our financial disclosures are public, you're applying,
Yeah, just the level of detail.
Yeah.
In which we,
yeah.
but there are no specific numbers in it, so.
No, we're starting to get a form of the village list. I don't remember we have a form.
Looks fine.
No, I think it's 6.
And Enid's picking up Wally.
Six, really? So. Look,
6 or 7.
How many are on our school board? Feels like more than that. 8?
8, it's a big long line across the front of the room. Yeah. Have a seat, Jill.
I was watching to see when I should come over and then it was 2:43 and I said, gotta leave yourself time to get over there.
That's okay. People got to take a break. But it's still not all that.
Good, how you doing?
That's bad. We've been us several before. There seems to be some themes out there. It's getting very difficult for towns to provide a variety of services, either because they're getting to be very expensive or because they can't get adequate personnel. I'm thinking of reappraisals on, which is one of the reports that's come in. But at the same time, people are very reluctant to give up any local control. And so we're kind of, I think everyone's sitting between a rock and a hard place. We've had many failures at trying to talk about any kind of municipalizing public safety kinds of, and now we're going to be talking about schools stuff. There seems to be a theme.
So there's definitely passage.
Well, I'm going to invest in paper company stock myself.
Okay, I think everybody, I need one more back. Okay, we're gonna start. We have got a break schedule. Okay. Floor is yours. You know, you can introduce yourself for the record. Okay.
Good afternoon. My name is Jill Remick. I'm the Director of Property Valuation and Review at the Tax Department. So we're a branch of the Tax Department that works directly with municipalities to implement everything related to the statewide education property tax system. And this is our annual report. It's a statutory requirement. There's lots of pieces in here. I came over to sort of walk you folks through it. There's a lot of data in it, and then there are a lot of supplemental reports on our webpage. If people really want to get into Excel and dig in there. I think I try and zoom, but if you have paper copies.
Do you have slides you could share?
I was just going to show the report on my computers, but I don't have a lot of slides.
Okay.
And I have to say, when we tried to cut back on printing, we got a lot of guff. This is one of those few reports people like to have in writing. Yeah. And I'm joined by my colleague Nate Feldman, who is the senior fiscal analyst at the tax department, who I might need to sort of phone a friend now and then on some of those deeper out. Right. So just broadly speaking, the Director of Property Valuation Review is a statutory construct. There's a whole bunch of duties and responsibilities that I have as director. And the way that we work with municipalities is everything from current use, valuation, grand list maintenance, exemption maintenance, helping with TIF and homestead. There's lots of different pieces. So basically at any point in time, anyone in PBR is interacting with municipalities, municipal officials in some capacity. So we also oversee a few statewide software systems to implement these plans. We have a current use program, software called EQs, and then we're kind of straddling two grand list softwares right now as we transition from one to the other. So we oversee all of those as well. We also are responsible for providing education to listers and assessors. So we have a series of annual trainings that we do. We also contract with the Vermont League of Cities and Towns, the Vermont Assessors and Listers Association, and the International Association of Assessing Officers to provide those trainings. And then we also have a certification program for listers and assessors who want to take their training to the next level. One of the major pieces of work that PBR staff does is the statewide equalization study. So every year they work directly with the towns. We look at 3 years worth of sales data, so from property transfer tax return data, and analyze those sales in comparison to their grand lists, remove sales that might be outliers or extremes or not arm's length transactions. And after that very intensive data analysis every year, we come up with the results of the equalization study, which are the CLA and the COD, which is a common level of appraisal, which we'll dig into more in a moment, and also the coefficient of dispersion, which is a measure of sort of equity within the town boundaries. We also work with municipalities on reappraisal. So we did provide a pretty big report. We're happy to come in. I think we might need to be already on the schedule to come in and talk about. It's a report from Act 68 from 2023. Moving Vermont to a 6-year reappraisal cycle. Right now, we don't really have a set or prior to Act 68, we didn't have a set cycle. So there are a lot of municipalities that have not reappraised in a long time. It's hard to find contractors to do this work, especially in the smaller towns. So we have a proposal for sort of responding to that and implementing the 6-year cycle. We also, PBR, top of everything else, we manage the current use program. So this program puts a lien on the property in exchange for certain requirements for forestry or agriculture. That taxes the property at the use value rather than their full market value. So it's property tax reduction, and our team oversees that work as well. And again, all of these I'll get into, but I'm just giving you sort of a big picture. We also work with municipalities every year to review all their various property tax exemptions. So there's a whole lot of exemptions that are statewide exemptions. And then there are also things that municipalities can vote to exempt on the municipal grant list. So every year we actually work with towns to sort of review their exemptions, make sure they're not expired, make sure they're categorized correctly. We also obviously collect municipal and incorporate our education property tax rates. So we've got a lot of that in here too. It's important that we collect the municipal property tax rates because that information is used for a few different statewide programs. So some people do get a property tax credit on their property tax based on income. And we need to have the municipal property tax rate to provide that municipal property tax credit as well. We also do what's called a hold harmless payment. So we use the municipal tax rate information to provide called the hold harmless payment for current use. So when a property is enrolled in the current use program, then they're taxed at those that their value is set lower. So they're paying less in both municipal and the statewide education property tax. So the hold harmless payment is used to make them whole. So it's a payment out of the general fund every year to municipalities to offset the current use revenue. Let's see, we also do administer property tax appeals. So right now, individuals can appeal their property valuation at the local lister or assessor level. They can appeal that to the BCA, the Board of Civil Authority. And then if they want to appeal beyond that, they have a choice of either appealing to me as PBR director or Superior Court. And then we have PBR hearing officers who hear those appeals as well. And then we do a whole lot of data and financial management for the various components needed for the statewide education property tax. We administer a grant program. So it's various statutory grants. So there's a per parcel payment to towns for doing the equalization study. There's a per parcel payment to towns for conducting a reappraisal study. There's the pilot payments, so the payments to towns in lieu of taxes for state-owned buildings. And then there's also our lister education program. So this report has a lot of all of that sort of in greater detail and some statewide information. We did add at the end too some of the more popular PDF versions of the tables. After last year, we ended up sort of needing to make those anyway. We figured we'd stick them in here. But there are more data tables on the tax department's website to sort of back up a lot of this information if people want them. So, all right. So I think I'd like to start. I don't think I have a whole lot of time, but so I know you have other folks coming in, but you have okay, good half hour. It took me 2 hours to go through this with Ways and Means this morning. Okay, we won't do that.
We don't.
All right, so one of the first sort of major looks at things going on. Let's see, there's the different tables. So table 3 and 4 are sort of the statewide picture of education values.
What pages?
Sorry, let's see, 12 and 13. So the categories that are listed on the left-hand side, so those are grand list categories. So for the equalization study, we're required to municipalities are required to categorize properties in one of these categories, and then we actually do the study on each category if there's enough properties to do that. So these are, obviously some of them are pretty self-explanatory, but there's a good deal of them here, right? Residential, different sizes. There's also some that, like other miscellaneous that different towns use for different purposes. So we are going to try to sort of clean those up and have fewer categories that might make sure we're categorizing everything correctly. But generally speaking, these are the ways that properties are categorized on the grant list. And just to be clear, that may not be how they're taxed as far as homestead or non-homestead, right? You could have a residential with 6 or more acres. That's not a homestead. You could have a farm that does have a homestead. So those are two different things, sort of the categorization that's by the highest and best use on the grant list are these, which may be very different from their actual taxation treatments. So I think on the bottom of that page, on page 12, I just thought that's important to point out. Just again, we're looking at double-digit increases in the statewide grant list value. So while the literal listed values, the values that properties are listed at went up about 7.8% due to like new construction, renovations, things like that, and obviously reappraisals. Excuse me. The total actual equalized education property value increased by about 14%. And that was after almost 14% the year before. And the year before that, I think it was 12. So we've had double-digit increases in the overall value of our property per month for 3 years.
Do you need something to drink?
Yeah, I don't know what's going on.
I can go.
Really sorry. Thank you. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
There's cough drops if you want.
Thank you. I don't think I'm sick. I
Jill,
think
you're
I've
not
just
the
been
first
talking all
person to
day.
go down it.
Oh, hi, Jill. Hi, Jill.
Or maybe Jake can go get you something to drink.
This will be free. Thank you very much.
I'm
so sorry.
It's hard to be talking when you're trying.
So yeah, again, so on page 13, I just think this is a really helpful thing to draw your attention to just sort of have, especially in light of the conversations you folks may be having, this sort of longitudinal picture about how the property values have increased over the past several years, and then they're really taking up these last 3 years.
Question.
Yeah.
The education list value, is that the same thing as ELA? What is that on page 13?
Right, so those are in billions, right? So those are,
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
got it. Okay, got it.
we do have the CLA coming right up. though.
Okay, got it.
Right, so you can just sort of see, right, the equalized value and the municipal value, those are continuing to increase. From year over year pretty soon. So 2 years ago, it might have been 88.9 billion, so it's 100.5 billion.
So how many towns are out of CLA compliance right
Almost.
Yeah, there's 191 between the CLA prior to 2023, and then we're about to issue 152 new reappraisal orders this year based on the COD only.
Okay.
Excuse me. I've been talking all day, so bear with me. It's getting up.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Okay. Okay, so on page 14, there's sort of another good summary that I wanted to make sure to draw your attention to. Not so much the table, but we sort of articulate here. And then on to the next page 15, the statewide CLA. So the CLA is the common level of appraisal. So we do calculate that for each town. And it's essentially comparing what your property is listed at versus what properties are selling for. So on a town by town basis, that gives us the CLA that's applied to the tax rate. And that's a way to basically adjust the tax rate to make up for bringing everyone up to 100% of fair market value. We also calculate that number on the statewide level. And as of this is the first year that we are actually applying that factor at a different point in the property tax calculation. So you'll probably get questions about that. We just released that back in early January, I suppose. Jake, do you want to take a stab at explaining the statewide CLA for a second?
Sure, yeah. If that's okay.
Introduce yourself for the record, and I guess microphone can pick him up. If you speak loudly.
Okay, yeah, I can speak loudly. Jake Feldman, Tax Department. There was a change to CLAs made last year that will take effect in the coming property tax year, starting in July. And it has to do with that number on the top of page 15, the statewide CLA. Basically, the change was instead of having each town's CLA as it is, it would be compared to the statewide CLA. So if your CLA was 72.36 and the statewide CLA is also 72.36, you actually get 100% CLA for a tax rate adjustment. And earlier in the tax rate calculation process, that same factor is applied to the yield and the non-homestead property tax rate. It end up washing out completely. So there's no impact to individuals' property taxes or what towns pay the ed fund. It's a total wash mathematically, but the point of it is for a few years in a row, the yield was going up because of CLAs going down, and school districts perhaps were reacting to the higher yield as seeing tax capacity, but then on the back end, their member towns were getting dinged with low CLAs. And, we heard that, or not we, the entire Vermont community was hearing like frustration with the CLAs dropping and using that as an explanation for why taxes were going up. So what the change made last year does is it basically when the Vermont real estate market is moving in one way altogether, like it has been, it takes that change out of the yield. So the rates that school districts work with, called like school district tax rates or equalized tax rates, are going to be much more similar going forward to the rates that actually people see on their bills. So there won't be that crazy seesaw that there has been.
Okay.
And we have a we did have a one pager on our website for a while about it. But all the school districts are very aware of their new CLA and the change, and they should be incorporating it. Yeah, so far so good, I think, with that.
Thank you, Jacob. I love when the tax bills come out.
So again, another sort of longitude figure on page 15 that I think is really helpful in the context of the property tax discussions you folks are having. The statewide CLA rate ideally would sort of be hovering around high 90s, 100%-ish, because that would mean that generally speaking, statewide, our property values are listed pretty close to fair market value. And you can see it really sort of continues to take this like steady clumps down. And I remember in 2022 when it hit 83, that felt very extreme. And now just 2 years later, we're at 72. So while there was obviously the COVID bump, it hasn't been a bump. It's been a continued, there seems to still be continued demand and property is still selling it higher than it's listed at by a fair amount.
But the real estate, history of the real estate market says what goes up will come
Right.
down.
Right.
And it has come down pretty precipitously in the past, so maybe being at 72% will be a good thing each year.
The other major component that comes out of the study is the COD, the coefficient of dispersion. So this is basically within a municipality's grand list, it's a measure of equity, both in categories and across different properties. So essentially you want to make sure that, according to, that you're generally speaking, valuing properties at about the same level of disparate from fair market value. Or similarly valued properties are showing they're selling a similar dollar amounts. Basically that you may be below, you might have the 80% CLA or 75, but if it's sort of consistent townwide, then at least everyone's still on the same boat. But the COD is measuring by property and municipality. Are you needing to take another look at that because it's inequitable within the town? So we do still have the statutory authority to issue reappraisal orders based on the COD.
So what happens when they can't get an appraiser?
Right.
Which apparently is happening. Right there.
Right, so towns do generally need to contract with a reappraisal contractor to do their full townwide reappraisal. That has been the case and that will continue to be the case under this 6-year cycle. We're already getting contracts through 2029 to approve. There's a queue of towns wanting to reappraise. There's only so many folks doing that work. And so they're already scheduling out that far. The reappraisal firms are very happy to hear about the 6-year cycle also, because it does give them a lot more predictability. They can hire people, they know they can staff up. There is one of our recommendations in the other Act 68 report is to move the grand list date from April 1 to January 1. And one of the reasons is right now, it creates a really tight appeal timeline. And so even for reappraisal firm wants to sort of staff up and do more reappraisals, they can't be two places at once during like 2 week window of time. If we have sort of longer runway for people to grieve and hearings, that can also sort of help alleviate that.
So I remember it is difficult to become a real estate appraiser. It's what, a 3-year apprenticeship? And there's a certain amount of market control that you don't have to apprentice someone. So it's not like I can go out and take a class and decide I'm now an appraiser. So it is that kind of a closed market where present appraisers control how many new appraisers can come into the market.
Yeah, there's not a clear career path. There's not a clear like certification or associates or any kind of designation really, which makes it challenging. It's really interesting in Vermont how many reappraising firms are generational. Like we have a lot, I can think of 3 or 4 off the top of my head, because they happen to know about this field and happen to, you know, they've seen their dad or their mom do it, and so they're in the business. But there are several that kind of the new.
But it was really interesting during the Great Recession when we had the issues with the realtors and exotic mortgages, that for a while they were required, banks couldn't have a contractor like with somebody that did their appraisals. And we had out of state contractors. I got more than one call at the real estate office saying, "Where's Callis?" And there were problems with not knowing the local market. That seems to have gone away, went away pretty quickly, but there was a time when you had appraisers coming in from out of state and they didn't know the market.
Yeah.
But it isn't a big broad base here.
Right, so the firms can pick and choose who they want to work with or not. So we definitely, and which is totally within their purview. We do hear from small towns.
Everybody coffee.
Oh, probably because it's so cold.
That could also do it.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
You're in good company.
No, it's usually me, but if it's cold, my eyes water. Right where you are, I always have Kleenex in my pocket.
Yeah, so there are challenges especially for smaller towns to find people to do this work, because is it really worth their time to drive 3 hours to do their parcels or something like that? So basically towns will contact us and say, we can't get anyone to respond to our RFP. We're not trying to have in compliance, but and then the other challenge is one of the other pieces that we're hoping to talk with you folks more about that's in that Act 68 report is how we can encourage towns to band together to contract with someone to do, you know, if you're already driving up to Barton, why don't you also do or League or Lindenville or something.
On what you just said, I read this report, lovely. But you said you want to work more with us. So do you have this being drafted as the next steps? Or I don't know how to translate what you just said, because I do see a lot of this needs action this session.
Yeah, if you folks want us to come in, all we have is that at this point, and we just presented it for the first time this morning at Ways and Means. So there are pieces that could be put in place sooner rather than later. There's also pieces that might have to wait and see how these other larger conversations shake out, but no, there's no bill or anything at this point, but yeah.
And I think it needs to roll into the bigger conversation about education property taxes and what we heard yesterday.
Miscellaneous, yeah, we'll have vehicles, we can. It says tax, right?
Yeah.
Yes, the ornament.
So I'll keep going if that's okay. I'm on page 18. This is another sort of bigger picture about the reappraisals. And so just to be clear, so the longer period of time that goes between a full reappraisal, then the more sort of regressive and out of line the values become. And And there's about 60 towns, so about 24% that have not done a reappraisal in the last 15 years. So if you can imagine the real estate market and what can happen in even a couple of years. The national standard is you want to do 4 to 6 years.
Oh, wait. Just,
Confirmation.
yeah, we're gonna do a I think we're doing a confirmation.
Okay, do you want it on the calendar for tomorrow? Or?
No, the confirmations go on the, yeah, on the back of the cover, and someday we do them all.
Okay, so it's okay if it's in the calendar for Tuesday.
Don't get done. In the same cadences. Regular bills.
So one last thing I'll say about reappraisal, again, there's a whole lot of information in that report. We have a natural, research that we did on that as well. Basically, the way that it has happened a lot in Vermont is if you go a really long time between reappraisals, then when you do the reappraisal, there's some major sticker shock. Because you're making up for a decade plus of values. And so the national expectation is like 4 to 6 years. And so the 6-year cycle that the legislature passed 2023 is great news for legal reasons. It makes it predictable, it makes it equitable, makes it less sticker shock, a lot more sort of connection for taxpayers between what their value is and what their property tax bill is. So we're really excited to put that in place. And I am happy to say, even right now, as we're kind of transitioning from the reappraisal order only or voluntary reappraisal system, which did not have a time frame, into the 6-year cycle, we have about 37 towns doing a reappraisal for 2025. So that's good. We want good new reappraisals. So moving on from the dry topic of reappraisal to current use, on the next page. Page 20 and 21 is just sort of a summary of the current use program. And also sort of the longitudinal look at just sort of the enrollment over time. Obviously, there's only so many acres of land in Vermont, so it doesn't continue to shoot up, but it does continue to sort of progress over time. Back when the current use program first started, right, it was a pretty small impact, and now about a third of Vermont's land area is enrolled in the current use program, which is pretty great. There's about just under 20,000 parcels enrolled in the program. And the majority are forestry, but so they can be forested or agriculture, and some are a combination of that. There's certainly a lot more forest acreage and forest parcels than agriculture. And we do work closely with the Department of Forest, Parks and Recreation. If it is a forestry parcel, they have to complete a forest management plan. There's very specific rules. They have to work with the county forester to be following that plan. There's pretty serious penalties if they cut contrary or do something else against their forest management. So one of the things I wanted to highlight, right, is that it is a lot of work to oversee the program because there's so much activity with property changing hands right now. So out of the almost 2,000 applications that we processed for this year, meaning people coming into the program or changing their enrollment. So there were 277 new enrollments, and some of those may have been in the program in the past, and then someone else bought it a couple years later. So yeah, I'm going to use program.
Yeah, but I sent a question to the commissioner, but I'll talk to you about Lady Bird Estates, what are the correct title? Anyway, having to re-enroll and go. It came
Yes.
from a former senator.
Yes, so of the 1,800 applications, only 277 were like brand new, straightforward. 243 were people who were adding to their enrollment. So a lot of times, especially like adjacent parcels, when you're like, okay, I'm going to retire, I'll sell my 10 acres to the farmer next door, and they'll add it to their enrollment. Like that happens a lot. But 1,249 were transfers. So there's a lot of changing hands of the property. But what really it is, a lot of it is trusts, LLCs, estates, things like that. Because the idea is that we have to make sure that we have agreement from the trustees or the remaindermen of any of these trusts and LLCs and things like that. So that if and when the time comes that the land use change taxes too, they know that and they're held liable for that land use change tax. But it is what we're seeing a lot. We're having to become experts in like deed reading and trusts and estates because that's what is really searching movement and current use right now, I would say.
Sure.
Our little corner of the world. Let's see. So yeah, on 22 and 23 is just sort of the long-term picture of sort of the volume of current use enrollment. Right, so the acreage doesn't change a whole lot. It's gone up slightly and then it's sort of gone up and down, but obviously, right, there's only so many acres that qualify. So that's understandable. So we've got about 19,692 parcels, about 16,000 owners. I think on the prior page, we noted that about 23% of the parcels are owned by out-of-state owners. And we just track that in zip code where we send them. Various things too. And then on page 23, farm buildings are taxed at 0 value. So for land in the program that's forest land, agriculture, or forest land that's greater than a mile from a road, a class 4 road, I think it is, there are use values. So basically, the reduction for property tax for current use is not that you just get like a percentage off your property tax. It's that the enrolled acreage or the enrolled farm buildings are taxed at that lower use value. And then that results in the property tax side of things.
Is this as common in other states? I hear rumors that this is somewhat in a way suppressing development. And if anything, it could be contributing to some of our macro housing problems by subduing the values that people are having to pay or the taxes they're having to pay on lands that could be developed homes. Do other states do this current use program or is this somewhat unique to Vermont?
They do. There are lots of different ways they do it. Some it's like a contract, 10 years you're in and then you're out. That's it. Some are when you leave the program, you have to pay back what you know, like the last 5 years or the last 3 years of your property tax savings. So they have various ways that they penalize removal from the program.
We penalize removal.
And we penalize removal of the land use change tax.
It's not cheap.
So yeah, there are similar programs. There's some interesting national research about the impact that has on development or whether it changes behavior as far as parcels that are enrolled in the program. There's lots of stuff on that. I won't opine on it, but yeah, our land use change tax construct is if it's the entire parcel is coming out, then it's a 10% of the enrolled acreage value. That's the penalty. So that's pretty straightforward. Our computer can do that for us. If it's a portion of the parcel, which is honestly a lot of what we're seeing, a lot of like a portion of the parcel, or you're transferring this smaller amount, or you're adding this, then it's valued as a standalone parcel. And that was designed that way to be a higher penalty for pulling out these smaller pieces. But from like an administrating perspective, it's really challenging because the lister has to come up with a new value. It can hold up real estate transactions. It can be wildly higher or lower depending on what that value is. So I don't have a solution for that other than the prior methodology was if it was a portion of the parcel, then you prorate what it would be based on the acreage. So
So if it's 1,000 acres and you were taking out 10, it was really cheap because large parcels are valued a lot less than a small building lot, just in general. And there was a lot of complaints on, I want to give my kid a place to build a home and you're going to charge me 100, so it doesn't cost anything, but technically the rest of us have been paying the taxes on that parcel because the towns get paid the full value and the ed fund makes up the difference, is my understanding. So the rest of the taxpayers have been paying the full taxes with the understanding that there is a common or public good to have conserved land. So we did up it a few years ago to the actual market value of a 10-acre lot in that Build-A-Bar in that town. But yeah, it probably does slow things down.
I guess just as a quick follow-up, I'd love to know how our 2.57 million acres now in current use compares to other states as compared to their land acreage, because it starts at 120,000. So do we have too many acres in current use, which is suppressing the market or the tax pressures on people, motivating them to then use it for other purposes like housing?
great question. Forest Parks and Recreation would say that there's also sort of economic benefits. You know, there's other ways that it's harder to measure, but absolutely unequivocally, the land use change tax is designed to penalize breaking off smaller pieces.
Yes. It is,
That is what it's
it
designed.
is serious. We are paying your taxes because of not to make it cheap for you to buy acreage and then decide what you're going to build. The thing was always on the cliff overlooking Lake Champlain. I think that's what brought it to everybody's attention. They took out the 10 acres overlooking the lake on, 1,000-acre parcel and paid a couple $100 to do it.
That's what I was told, that out of state wealthy individuals are exploiting our current use program, benefiting from it, our tax policy to maintain their scenic, we call it, views.
Well, we also have farmers, people that lease their front yard, the field that they look at, to the farmer. And that land is, you have 30 acres, you lease it to a farmer, it's in farmers and he hays it. And I've sold more than one property where that's not an uncommon thing that happens. So we can look at that because we're gonna be looking at the grand list. But if you're haying it and you're a farmer and you are leasing that land, then the owner of that land, it's in the farmer's current use.
I will say, Senator, there are some states that have income requirements, so it's really designed to support people who have income need to maintain the right. So Vermont, there's your income, other than at the other end where you have to be earning 50% of your annual income as a farmer to qualify as a farmer. There's no income cap or review on.
But other states do.
But some states do. Some states do.
We're gonna be looking at everything this year.
Right. So,
But you're welcome to do the research.
So, on that note, on page 24 and 25, so, I think I've articulated the current use advisory board is a statutory board that sets the use values every year. And they also create the administrative rules that oversee our program. And that board is made up of, positions like mine, and then of course, Parks and Recreation, Agency of Agriculture, municipal officials. We have folks who have to be in actively agriculture, actively forestry. So we have the current use advisory board membership. And so they're meeting February 12th to set this year's values, which I think the statutory deadline is maybe February 15th or the end of February.
And
So so on page 24, that says TBD because they're setting that on February 12th.
we're gonna have to wrap it up shortly because of.
Now that my throat is finally. Now that I can breathe.
There we go.
So
So we will have you back.
Okay.
Obviously, we're gonna be digging in to a lot of this as we work on it through everything. So just,
I'm gonna do a quick wrap up.
Yeah.
Okay.
just speak trends.
Right, so there's, on page 25, just back to the point about the impact of current use, right? So there are municipal tax savings to landowners. And then there's also the education tax, foregone revenue, so that's articulated statewide on page 25, and one of the back, tables has that by town. There's a few other sections in here that just sort of summarize very briefly exemptions and tips. There's statewide tax rate information in here, and then again, there's town by town tax rate information in here. Talked about appeals. Yeah, and I think that's sort of the first blush, but yeah, we did submit a report about use values that was required. It was the Act 146 of 2022 report, and then we did also the Act 68 of 2023 is the reappraisal one. So there's a lot of stuff in there as well. But yeah, I'm happy to come back anytime. It's helpful.
We will be going through all of this and the reappraisal study because I don't know if that comes here to Gov. It probably goes to Gov.
The what? The reappraisal?
Reappraisal.
It was,
Reappraisal.
it wasn't GovOps last time, but I think it could go either way.
Was the VLCT worked with on the appraisal report in close concert?
Yeah, and those folks are here. We definitely did, we have, kept in touch, and actually a couple of years ago, what precipitated the conversation about it in the first place was Karen Horn at VLCT was like, we got to get on a regular cycle for reappraisal. So that was very much like a shared goal. There are obviously some pieces in here that it's really hard to sort of break through, like the shared contracts across towns. But also, yeah, I think, and also like what we can do to sort of professionalize and keep good quality people doing this work and make it something someone could actually have as a career path, that they actually can make a living at it.
Born into it.
VLC.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nice to see everybody. Thanks for the kindness of the water and.
Everybody's here again. Katie, I had a break scheduled, but we're running over, so take a break if you need it. But I was trying to get someone from the administration, and I have 3 people now.
Wow.
We over-delivered. Okay.
No such thing.
Wow. So the deputy secretary. Yes, she's. Secretary. It's a lot.
That is.
Okay, well, going fiscal is here, just listening. But this is our first go through, and I will tell you next week, we're gonna go in package package, like what are the ways, what you're keeping, what you're doing, why, the impact that we're going to go. But, I haven't, we're not starting weights, but probably with the whole income sensitivity. What are you replacing it with? How are you calculating the numbers? And we're gonna try and go through block by block so that we understand enough so that we can ask questions.
Okay, great. I saw that request, and so what I was thinking is after Amanda presents today, and then you can tell me exactly what you'd like us to do next week. And Jake, it sounds like you've got a piece of that as well, the income sensitivity.
Yeah, how that's gonna work. Okay.
And my plan was to just put this one on the hot seat, also on the side, and really just sort
Hopefully
of
she
like.
doesn't develop. Funny.
Right? I don't know.
No.
I'm gonna bring my water. I will be ready to run to the fountain.
Does seem to be catching.
Yeah.
Wow. We might hit our 22 person.
And then if there are any like AOE
There's one
questions
seat
or.
here. Is the window still? Oh, that chair.
Yes.
Oh.
It's fair. I think it's nicer than the chair.
Well, it is on strike, but, yes, okay, that is good, because we've had a folding. Starts, it starts the witness out looking up at all of us, which is really not fair in power dynamics. If I want to do that, I'll do it on purpose.
I can probably just hit one of those handles and just sink my chair down.
If you want to go down lower or up.
Okay, and I joined the Zoom and I'm not facing such a so I'll share my screen.
So this, I think we're just looking for an overview as to what you're planning to do to the system and give us a chance to just ask some basic questions that we didn't get a chance to ask yesterday.
Perfect. We're gonna my thought had been to take a little step deeper than what you saw yesterday to talk about kind of the theory of action and how we are approaching coming up with the base and weights to your point that you'll see next.
Okay.
So let me just get this. All right. So thank you all again for taking the time to have me here today. It'll be just myself. Justin Silverstein had to fly back to present to the Colorado legislature tomorrow. So apologize that you just get one of us at the moment. But he's here in
Happy
spirit.
to have one.
So, like I said, I want to take a little deeper step into the proposal that you saw yesterday, really digging into more the funding formula components. So there's kind of three levers, but we're going to focus on funding for today. So within what we're proposing for moving to a foundation or student-based centered formula is starting with a base funding amount that would be the amount of funding that every student in the state should receive. This would be a student that has no additional extra needs. They're not economically disadvantaged. They're not an English learner. They're in a district that has no particular circumstances that you need to adjust for. So I like to think about when we say the base, it's really the floor of funding that you want to make sure every student has, which we'll talk about how you set that using perhaps the evidence-based approach to really be able to stay at that base level. What's the education experience, quality and opportunities can we expect all of our students to receive? So that again is the foundation and the floor upon which we build the rest of the funding formula. From there, then there are adjustments for student need. And we will use student adjustment and kind of weight a little bit interchangeably. And I want to make a couple distinctions when we get there versus for what a weight is in your current system and what it might be in a foundation formula. But those are again addressing student needs. So including addressing if a student is economically disadvantaged, an English learner, a CTE student, preschool students, and then also being able to provide additional funding for special education students. And sometimes you provide that through a weight. What we're going to recommend here is a categorical. So again, just there's base funding for everyone, and then additional targeted dollars for students based on their need. And finally, you also want to adjust for school and district circumstances. And by that, I mean cost drivers in communities. So being depending on your scale, that has cost impacts of that. If you're in a geographically isolated or sparse community, that has cost impacts. So you want to make sure your formula is doing its best to account for all the different characteristics and experiences of your communities. So those are the pieces that we're going to talk about. And I'll walk through each one of them. And again, the rationale and thinking behind each. I want to start off by saying for identifying what those parameters are, the pieces of the funding formula. We took a number of steps to review the current funding system components, approaches of other states, and findings from other state adequacy studies. And then Vermont's really lucky in that it has a really robust and rich body of research on what should be there. There are a lot of studies to read through. I'm sure you all have been a part of these. But we're very lucky to not be walking into a place where you have to start from scratch. You had a lot of good information to look at here. And I realize I think we've said it in some other presentations, but just a little background on APA, Ogden Gleich and Associates, of the firm that I'm a part of, has been working across the country in school finance for the past 4 years. I wasn't there for all of those years, but I've been with APA for about 20 years now. So we work across the country helping states think about how do you review, design, modify your school funding formulas. And we've helped design a number of state systems that are currently in place right now. Through that time, we've also worked quite a bit with Picus Audit and Associates. I said that way too fast together. So when we get to talking about that evidence base, we have a lot of experience thinking about how that works in different states. So again, this whole slide is just to say we are not starting from scratch. We're trying to leverage what we know from the field across the country, from APA's work, and with the really robust information that's already available in Vermont.
And of course, Picus has sent 4 kids through college on consulting contracts with Vermont.
You kept him busy there. Yeah. His name came up in a number of those studies that we looked at. So again, the foundation, the base amount is really the base of your whole funding system on which all your other adjustments run. So you really want to make sure there's a strong rationale for how you come to that. Clearly, you could approach this as a math problem and just say, how much money do we have? Let's divide it by the number of kids, and there you go. But you really want to think about, again, what's that education opportunity that you're trying to provide all students through that funding amount. So again, we did not start from scratch here. We looked at the work of Picus and Audin from the September 2024 report that they recently produced. In that work, they used the evidence-based approach, which is one of kind of 4 approaches to adequacy. And adequacy being identifying how much money do you need to meet the expectations and standards you have for students in your state. The evidence-based model is one of 4 approaches that have been used nationally over the past 30, 40 years now. The evidence-based model specifically is the basis of the funding system in Arkansas and Wyoming. So they're both used for research purposes, for policy purposes, and in those 2 cases have been also upheld by the courts as a rational means of identifying their spending. Again, every state's court cases and legal requirements are very different. So, but just to know that rational, it's been upheld. So it's not a bad starting point, if you will. The evidence-based model is built on reviewing all the available best practice research, academic research that has demonstrated what resources are needed to be statistically significant for improving the outcomes for students. So it looks at that research, then applies it to what they call prototypical schools. So schools of a certain size. So say, if you, in this case, have an elementary school, 450 students, how many teachers do you need? How many counselors? Do you need a principal? That sort of thing. So they really, it's one of the approaches we think about as an input-based approach that builds from the ground up and tells you how many specific resources that you would have, and then applies a price to that, versus some of the other approaches that use existing data, such as a cost function approach to model current spending projected to a higher level of performance. The EB model has a very specific theory of action for how they get to those resources. And I refer you back to the PICUS report for the pages that they spend on that. Larry really spent his career developing that model. But what I will say is, while it's a very specific way you could think about using the resources, we are using it as a means of estimating the amount of funding that's needed, not in really more of a prescriptive, this is how you should then go spend those dollars method. Okay. So this is just here recapping what's in that starting point of the EB model. So it identifies class size ratios of 15:1 K through 3, 25:1 4 through 12. It also identifies specials or electives teachers to provide both planning time for staff and really robust education kind of course opportunities for students. It also has instructional support, including coaches that work with teachers to improve practice, interventionists that work with students to provide in a multi-tiered system of support, kind of tier 2 interventions, so one-on-one small group support, library media specialists. It also includes student support like counselors, a nurse. It tends to have a principal in every school, assistant principals as well in high school, and then secretarial staff. And then a position that's somewhat unique in the EB approach of supervisory aides, which are kind of hourly staff that cover things like bus duty or lunch duty to protect teacher things. So these are really the school level resources that are in the EB phase that we're going to talk about how we would recommend adjusting them to be more specific to Vermont. But there's also identified resources at the district level. There's also non-personnel resources like supplies, materials, student activities, maintenance and operations to create the whole package. But I'm really focused for now on the school level resources and how we think you might want to adjust them. So coming out of that PICUS and audit report, there was both acknowledgements in the report that it is representing perhaps a scale that does not exist in Vermont currently. It's built based on some prototypical schools that are much larger than what's in Vermont right now. So elementaries and middles of 450 students, high schools of 600. Average school size in Vermont is probably 200 students. They're much smaller settings. So we wanted to think about, how do you take what is a very strong national model for education, an accepted way of identifying what you need to spend, and adjust that for the Vermont context. So we are going to see on the next slide some recommendations that we made to build up that base. Coming from a couple things. We wanted to consider that scale issue that's in Vermont to make it fit what currently is happening. We wanted to include the community and stakeholder feedback that we heard during the listening tour about what was important to Vermonters, about what they wanted to see in their schools for students. We also have adjusted areas where, through our time working in school finance, we have worked with PICUS and audit in 5 states now, running both their approach, the evidence-based, as well as what we call the professional judgment, where we bring in educators to get their perspective on what resources are needed. So running those approaches concurrently, there's some areas that tend to come up as places that educators or the field think need to be adjusted in the EB model. And we'll highlight a couple of those things include like additional administrative support and student support particularly. There seems to be a little bit of a lag in the research because the evidence-based model is built on the research that shows significant outcomes for students, like testing outcomes. And some of those student supports perhaps aren't showing up there yet in the research. So it's an area people tend to want to adjust. So we kept those things in mind. And we also considered what are key policy priorities for Vermont. We know CTE is a particular area of interest and offering really robust college and career readiness to students. So those were the rationale for why we're suggesting starting from the ED and then making some changes. So the changes we recommended to the model that was presented in September 24 by Picus and Auden is to have additional electives and specialist staffing at the middle school level at a level that's more similar to a high school to allow for that course offerings, allow for college and career exploration and exposure in earlier grades. We've also, staying with that same train of thought, the high school added some additional teaching positions to allow for that college and career readiness, additional student support, as I was talking about at all levels, to really provide mental health services for students, adding assistant principals at elementary and middle, both consistent with what we've heard nationally and how Vermont tends to staff down. We also changed the nursing staffing level to better align with Vermont's current expectations, their education quality standards. That's a lower ratio. So we wanted to adjust that to fit. We've also increased teacher salaries within the model. So the model is built by taking the resources you'll see in a second and applying average salaries and benefits to them. So we have increased teacher salary used for that models to be higher than the average. And we've also, this fits with the other idea, provided some additional kind of per student money for CTE materials and coursework in both middle and high schools and to support flexible pathways. Because that was, again, a need we are really hearing, particularly from the Listen and Learn tour across the state. So this chart just briefly, oh, please.
I don't, it might be too granular for this moment in time, but I'll ask it anyway. You can just say no, but I had a question about teacher salaries. I totally understand the desire for more rural areas to want to retain their teachers, because I know there's like this pilgrimage of teachers moving from one area to another. At the same time, the cost of living does vary from different parts of the state to different parts. How are you sort of taking into consideration that complexity?
It's a great question, and there's a lot of complexity there. For now, for the base, it was simply adjusting the average by an amount, but I think there's a larger policy conversation about how do you think about that salary parity across the state, both in terms of thinking about the different cost of living. And what we saw when we were doing the analysis for the Listen and Learn tour is that your smaller, higher need communities also tend to be able to spend less on salaries. So their teacher salaries tend to be lower. So I think some of the larger governance policy recommendations start to get into that as you think about larger districts and pieces like that. But so there's a piece of it here, but not the whole puzzle. Great.
I just, an observation, because I noticed on the recommended adjustments throughout, every single one of them will cost additional money. And I don't see any recommendations that would save us money. Are there any?
That is a great question, and I like it's very to the point. So I think you're right. The adjustments that we're making to the base are adding more dollars than what was estimated in the Picus and Auden report. I think the question of how it compares to current spending is separate. So I think there are opportunities for savings in the system as we think about the scale question. And so part of this is built on there's already some assumptions that are different than your current spending in the base. So those class sizes that you saw are larger than many class sizes that you have now. And those are really, class sizes is probably your biggest driver as you think about what's the cost of education. So I think there is opportunities for cost savings, not necessarily in how we buy. The class size is a piece of the base that's already identified that. But you're right, nothing here is taking away from what was recommended. So
well, I guess just as I look at it, I look at what our has to be this,
Mhm.
this year, given where we are from a tax standpoint, is we've got to figure out how to do what we do better, but also at a lower cost.
Mhm.
And if we, have great ideas, it's not that any of these are bad ideas,
Yeah.
they're not.
Yeah.
It's, what are they gonna cost and how are we gonna pay for it? And is there any place in what we're talking about overall in which we should be able to do things more effectively and at a lower cost?
Mhm.
The
And I think
taxpayers.
that's a great question and comment, and I think will be better answered once we've started putting out the specific numbers that are for the base and weights. But I think I can at least highlight the evidence-based model that coming out of that September 2024 report was about a $40 million difference between what, $400 million difference between what you're spending now and what that approach recommended as efficient. Again, that was, I think, what you could say if Vermont was at its absolute most efficient point.
Mhm.
So I don't think that's where you would land to really represent the scale and need that you have in your state. But I think there is opportunities for savings through going with the approach, is what I was trying to say.
I think that just the task that this legislature has is to
Mhm.
evaluate any of these proposals, though, it needs to be based on where we are, a cost benefit approach and an approach that will be looking very closely at added costs for anything.
Yep, no, I agree
That's
completely.
what this committee is going to be doing, putting numbers to everything.
I think one thing, Senator, that's important to understand is these adjustments are adjustments that they're recommending be made to the recommendations that Ficus and Auden made in their report. These are not adjustments to what is currently happening. These are adjustments
Okay.
to
Fair enough.
the recommendation from Ficus and Auden. So it's not on top of what we already do. It's on top of what they were recommending, which, as Amanda said,
It was much lower.
was much lower than what we're already doing. So this is just trying to get to an appropriate foundation amount. And it will be easier to understand when we have the math.
Mhm. Yeah. Appreciate the question.
We're going to be doing a deeper dive into absolutely every section next week. Excuse me, Mark, I'm catching whatever's going
What
on
a-
here.
I'm gonna go present for Paul. I don't know. No, so great question. Again, the recap, these are just the adjustments that we just talked about in the prior slide, kind of shown as numbers, but we'll keep on it going.
And I think what we don't know is what we have now.
Mhm.
And we may never know that if we in fact decide to go to this more consolidated model.
Mhm.
So there are fewer schools, which make it easier to provide those supports for the same amount of money, because you will have fewer of it. You will have more things, but fewer of them.
Mhm. And I think that's why what's being put forward is really, a multi-pronged approach. Funding is not the only answer that will resolve the question at hand. You have to think about the scale and the quality piece of it.
Senator Collins, can I add something?
Yes.
All right, for the record, Jill Briggs Campbell, interim deputy secretary of education. And Amanda, I think you actually articulated this really well. We have sort of three policy levers that we're looking to pull. And there is always a question of, well, this is really complicated and we're asking to do it fast. Can we start to disentangle this? And our recommendation is no, please don't. Because the funding formula here is one that is meant to provide a high quality education, and Vermont high quality really is to a high standard for every Vermont student. We could attempt to achieve that in our existing system, but it would actually cost a lot more. And so this funding foundation formula is predicated on other changes in terms of governance and scale, but also in terms of accountability. And that's a piece that's really critical. You really need to pull all three levers at once in order to achieve cost savings at high quality that treats every student fairly. And those are kind of our principles for how we move forward here. And Amanda, you actually articulated really well that the the way that your team approaches this is that the funding isn't driving the quality, right? You can take that approach. You can just change the formula and hope that everybody makes the choices that you want them to make. We're somewhat skeptical of that, just given some of the sort of traditions within Vermont that make that really hard to achieve. So there's the funding choices, and then there's the policy choices that go with them that need to be implemented, that need to actually follow through in order to achieve those goals.
Can I ask a quick, sorry, can you tell us what you mean by accountability?
Yeah, so I think there's accountability we mean it in all the possible ways.
Okay.
So, I think this is how we're thinking about how you ensure quality at a fiscally sustainable way. So currently, the state accountability structure is a fairly weak one. And so what we are really looking at is, as we're making choices, for example, I know a critical choice that folks are thinking about is, we've used this term, schools that are small by necessity or small by choice, right? And we need to get really concrete, really fast about how we as a state are going to define what is a school that's small by choice. And one of the ways that we do that is we define what quality means, right? So it can be things like, is the school system sort of financially viable? But also critically, what we're saying is every student should have certain educational opportunities, and we need to be very clear about what those opportunities are, and then measure, are schools delivering those opportunities? If a school is really small and we identify that they're not able to deliver those opportunities, there may be a menu of options available to them, right? They can do more precise staffing. They can share resources with another school, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of options, but one of those options may be consolidation. And that's where those questions come in around, like, okay, geographically, is the school isolated? Maybe the school is full at 70 and its neighboring school also has 70 kids and it's full. And so it would actually cost us quite a lot more to build a new school. So these are all choices that need to be made. But I think as a state, that's what we mean by accountability. We have to be really clear about what quality means. And then we actually need to measure and to actually really follow through on that, which has been historically, I would say, a challenge.
Right. And then the question is what to do when they're not available.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
We've got a lot of small schools that don't have room to take in another school's worth of kids. And that, plus we've got a lot of schools in poor physical condition. And that's another whole set of decisions we're going to have to make.
Yes.
And no money.
And that.
Okay.
So,
Well, that's pretty impressive.
so we talked a bit about what's in that base, that really that foundational block of the whole funding formula. From there, you then want to adjust for student need. And this is where I want to clarify a little bit about what we mean by weights. So right now you have Act 127, which established what we call taxing capacity rates. So I think you were hearing a great presentation on from the Department of Taxation, but when we think about the funding for student need, you have weights in your system that give communities the opportunity to spend more, but not bear that entire financial burden. But what we're seeing when we do our kind of preliminary analysis of post Act 127 implementation is that your poorer communities do not appear to have taken advantage of that additional capacity. It's often those communities that just struggle the most to pass their budgets, even though they would benefit proportionally more than some other communities. So it's a bit of a disconnect between the intention of the weight and the practice that we're seeing. So your weights right now, again, are not driving specific student spending. You don't have, say, a 20% weight that's saying then, oh yes, this community is going to receive 20% more dollars to serve these students. They have the option of going out for that money, but they don't necessarily have it. So It's just, again, disconnect between intention and what's happening. So when you move to a foundation formula, it's more specifically saying, here's how much additional resources or money we want to be spent on those students. Here's that in relationship to our base. That's how we create a weight. So the weight is a representation of the extra money that you want to see spent on those students. So it's just, again, just want to name a shift between how you think about it now and perhaps how you think about it before.
The nice thing about the weights being baked into the formula is that they're not subject to the winds of political, whims. And they're also, when times get tight financially, they're just part of the system. Have you seen, do you have data or maybe even just anecdotally that the weights get cut, the categorical grants get cut over time because
I would say,
the funds spent so much?
I would say anecdotally, it's much easier to cut categoricals than it is to cut a weight. You see both things happening. You see categoricals that are cut over time or just stagnate. They were set for, I think, just was giving a good example earlier, you put 50 million in for this, and then 10 years later, it's still $50 million you're allocating, but you're serving 100 more kids or twice as many kids. So I think
That should happen in Vermont.
yes.
Boy, I wish we had that problem.
Or maybe perhaps it's the other way. You're appropriating 50 million for it, but now you're only serving 5 kids.
Yeah.
It could go both ways. They tend to get stuck or get cut and can somewhat be both restricted in how they can be used and sometimes at odds with each other from year to year. So our recommendation as a firm would be to put as much as you can into your formula that you expect to be kind of a predictable ongoing thing and have less categoricals. Use categoricals for particular pilot initiatives, for if you were having a transitional program or during the transition period, you wanted to have additional funding. Things you don't expect to continue long-term are fine for categorical grants, but things you expect to be ongoing, put it in your formula. And the great thing about if you put it in as a weight, then it also adjusts over time. As you adjust your base, your weights also, are based on the base. So the base moves, the weights move as well. So I hope that answered your question.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Thanks.
So yeah, that's
The weights have to be recalculated too, though. And that's something that happens a lot in formulas is that the weights do not get recalculated.
yes. Yeah. So I think I entirely agree. I think as part of a best practice review, you do regular review of your formula, including your base and weights, particularly if you think expectations have changed or you're not seeing perhaps the outcomes you expected once you put in this investment, revisiting stuff. So circling back to a slide I shared earlier, you have a lot of available research in Vermont about what weights or targeted funding amounts could be. And I want to go back to that first distinction I made. Your current system has been using tax capacity weights. So there's a touch of disconnect between a weight when it doesn't have a base to go with it. There's not a specific dollar amount that it's trying to drive to. So we're going to be showing a little bit of apples and oranges on a couple slides because of that difference. Some of your studies have been looking at what should it be under a tax capacity systems, and some are based more on what are the dollars you're trying to generate for a student. So just, I want to name that. It came up in our last, they're a little different from each other. To that end, you see varying weights on our targeted funding levels from the different studies that you see. So where we could, we tried to extrapolate out what the assumed additional funding would be for a student, because that's a little easier to compare to each other. You have an actual dollar. So we are proposing a number of weights as part of the funding formula, including one for economically disadvantaged. Currently, you have a tax capacity weight of 1.03. When we look at kind of the studies that have been done since, the task force weight was that same weight. It also identified that could generate about $10,000 a student in 2021 dollars. So obviously you need to think about that inflated. The EB study also identified weights for economically disadvantaged students. They really had it was either a weight of 0.34 or 0.49, depending on what percentage of your students were participating in extended learning. They kind of had 50% or 100%. So those are the on-off there. The EB weights, again, really identified the resources needed for students. They tended to be additional interventionist support, student support for before and after school, summer school programming, mostly focused on academic resources and not necessarily wraparound services, so not counselor or psychology support. So something to keep in mind as you see those lower weights, that they might not be everything to provide to at-risk students. So we are going to be recommending a weight for economically disadvantaged that when it's applied to what we consider robust base would generate a level of funding that's probably closer to the amount of funding per student that was in the earlier years. Even though the weight itself might be different, we're looking at a similar scale of additional funding. And we think we're going to land with a weight that will be one of the higher weights for economically disadvantaged students in the country. So robust base, resource weights is what we're kind of theory of action. And then coming back to saving money later as we think about the pieces of the puzzle. English learners, you have a very high tax capacity rate of 2.49 in the system. The preceding study that again is the tax capacity rate was 1.58. The EE study similarly ranged based on that assumed percentage of kiddos that were participating in extended learning. So obviously it's a much lower weight. There's a 0.4 up to a 0.6. And then we also have from the 2024 Colby study on English learners, an amount that's recommended. So again, little disconnect here. One are thinking about kind of tax capacity. And then the EB and the Colby study are more thinking about the amount of funding that would be generated.
Okay, so that's in addition to the base?
That's in addition to the base. So they recommend that amount above the base. Our recommendation will be kind of twofold. If you use a single weight, we would recommend a weight that's much lower than the 2.49. That's a tax capacity weight, again, that's significantly higher than the EB report weight. And we would probably be in a similar scale as the amount of funding per student that was recommended in the 2024 report. Again, this will be easier to understand when we have actual numbers next week for you all, but just trying to get a theory of action if we were looking at what you have now, what's the range that research might suggest?
What I remember about this topic is that the committee that dove into this actually came forward with a recommendation that we not use weights on English language learners and instead use categorical aid. But then when it was in the legislature, that was not reversed, but the committees of jurisdiction went with the weights itself. They wanted, I believe, looking at one of the members of the chair, is that they saw categorical aid for these students as directing dollars towards resources that would support them. Did I hear you say earlier that you don't?
Can I actually?
Yeah, answer that and then
So what we recommended was to use a categorical aid for English language learners, largely because, as Amanda has pointed out, the tax capacity weight leaves the ability to use that tax capacity up to the local districts or even more targetedly to the local voters. And so the committee was concerned that districts may not take advantage of it, and many of them didn't. And so therefore the English language learners would not actually have the resources that they required. There was also a lot of concern that the weights, among some of us, that the weights were not completely accurate for English language learners. So that's why we came to and all three of us were on this committee. Yeah. That's why we came to the recommendation that the categorical aid might be a better vehicle in the system we have right now, which allows tax capacity to be somewhat optional. The use of tax capacity to be optional. In the context of what is being proposed, it's not. It's a different type of weight. It's a different type of formula altogether. It's imposed from the state level rather than the choice being whether to use the tax capacity at the local level.
But will be categorized? Will it be focused resources?
Yeah, so what I would say is what we're recommending is putting it as a weight in the funding formula versus a categorical. In part to to the comment that this is actually intending to drive dollars to school sites versus capacity to do so. So you are guaranteeing that those dollars are reaching the system to serve students. What I'm going to say though, we are seeing states that are taking there's been kind of a split before of weighted funding is more block grant, local control. Categoricals tend to be more prescriptive in how they can be used. We're seeing a bit of a middle ground of states setting requirements for how weighted funding can be used. Different requirements to demonstrate that it's being spent on the students that it was supposed to be generating for.
Yeah,
And states vary how they approach. So it's not to say if it goes to a weight that you can't set guardrails to ensure that it's used for the students it generates. Those don't have to be opposite thoughts.
And yeah, and I think that's one thing that Pupil Weighting Committee started these conversations about how do we put behind the weights this level of accountability just to require districts to use the funding in certain ways or to prove that they're using the funding in certain ways. And we didn't, because we were our task and our charge was so focused on how do you change the weights. It wasn't more focused on the broader question that Senator Brock asked 8 billion times, I think is my last count. If you were going to just redesign the system from the floor up, how would you do it kind of thing? But we did have a lot of conversations about accountability and how we could put that behind the weights. And we just didn't, get there. But I think that's what the deputy secretary was saying is like, don't do this in a one-off way, do it all together. The pupil weighting study was it was just focused on how do we change the weights. And every time we tried to do something broader than that, we literally were yelled at.
It was a group that was,
Yeah.
It was somewhat controversial, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
There were some unpleasant names thrown around. And yes, it wasn't on that committee, and I think I was.
they
glad I was.
fundamentally distrusted the categorical aid idea because they feared that it would become stagnant and it would.
Yeah.
Senator
So-
Cummings, can I add maybe a broader comment as well? I think you're raising a really important comment and it's something that we've been thinking a lot about. So, an example that we can think of is with our federal Title I dollars. They are generated by individual student need, right? So a student, free and reduced lunch student or a student with economically disadvantaged generates a certain dollar amount for a district. The title funds don't say they've changed over time. But sort of current thinking is the title funds don't say that dollar must attach to that student and you must demonstrate that those services are being received by them because we take a universal design approach to learning, right?
Yeah.
However, you do have to demonstrate that, say, in a district, the dollars are proportionately going to the school where the students are that have the need. And we've been talking about this. We actually have some good existing models in districts that have done this work. It's an equity budgeting model. So Maple Run and Burlington both have this model where they're proportionately allocating dollars to the schools based on characteristics of those students. And in addition to that, they have sort of extended money, again, based on the sort of student characteristics that I think they call like innovation grants or innovation funds, right? So the school actually has a lot of local control. So let's say they have a high-need school, they're going to get sort of a bigger pot of money and they can kind of innovate with it. And it really becomes sort of an incubator for good practice. So I think, again, policy decision, but this is why you have your funding formula and then you have your policies that go with it. And this is part of that accountability is I think that we should seriously consider the guardrails that go with this kind of foundation formula. We do want it to drive the funds towards the students that sort of generate the dollars. It's not a one-to-one voucher system, right? But it is, there should be some proportionality and fairness. And with this kind of system, we can be much more transparent about that. I think, Amanda, you can speak to this. This is what some other states are doing. And we can literally do this through counting the hopes,
Mhm.
right? And so really to think about how we have a system that is not only fair, but transparently fair and
Mhm.
accountable.
Mhm. Yeah, both, I think to your point, the transparency in how funding is generated and then transparency in how it's being spent.
And I'm gonna start moving this along.
Yes, yes.
A lot of this, the good news is, will have to be decided by the education committee.
Mhm.
And then we'll decide how to pay for it.
Yeah.
Or if it's worth paying for, I mean, it.
Yeah.
But we're gonna start, this is the 5,000 foot
Yeah.
theory. We're gonna start getting closer and closer to Earth. As we go through the next week or two.
Yeah.
We're already into February.
So I'll hit just a couple other points just to get us wrapped up. We're also going to be recommending a wait for CTE students. And when I'm saying CTE students, we're really thinking about CTE students that are served in a CTE center. As I talked about before, we really try to put some resources for every student to have career exploration and actual coursework in their high school. So this is above and beyond what we identified in the base. Yep.
This doesn't quite work with how we fund CTE in Vermont. And so I encourage you to look at that model, which is very different and inconsistent even within the state. So this won't work the way that we currently fund CTE.
Yes, and the intention is to replace how you currently fund CTE. AP has been working for the past year or so around CTE governance and funding. And one of those recommendations is to move to a single statewide CTE entity. So then you would fund to that entity to then pay to your technical center. So you would get rid of I think there's 3 different payments for CTE working in the system. So this is intended to recognize that you do it very differently now and to replace how you're doing it.
Okay.
I think we need to just let you go through and give us all the information and then.
Yeah.
This is a completely different system that you are proposing.
Yeah.
So none of our current practices at this point are relevant to this decision. Once we get into the discussion, we will decide, and folks at the other end of the hall will decide.
Yeah.
If it should be relevant. But this is, we got a cow and this is a chicken. I mean.
So the other recommendations we have is your system currently actually counts preschool students as less than a full. We are recommending you count them as a full ADM based on some additional recommendations. Special education, right now, we were recommending continuing the current census block. So this is a place where what you're doing now, absent further study, we think you go with that, but you do need to be mindful. Right now, there are expenses being incurred locally that are not paid for out of the census block or federal funds. So we're still looking through that, thinking through how do we need to adjust funding to account for that.
So we've got a chicken that says move.
It does. It occasionally moves.
She's going with that.
It'll move in a couple other places. The other adjustments you need to make to the system is to school scale. As we talked about, the base is assuming much larger schools. You currently make some adjustment for size as part of your tax capacity weights. We think that's a good approach to think about. We would make some adjustments to that. Right now, you provide some tiered weights. We think it's better to have a formula in place so you're not having what we would consider some funding cliffs where you get very different funding if you had 99 students versus 101. You want it to be a little smoother of a curve for that. We would also recommend providing additional funding to schools less than 450 students instead of just less than 250 to really ease into that base. And then this is where I want to make a distinction again between a funding choice and a policy choice. We're building the funding adjustment for size to allow you to make a policy choice about what schools are necessarily small. So we're building an adjustment that takes into account the cost of doing business at different school sizes, but not saying who's eligible for that. Right now, your necessarily small definition is based on being in a sparsely populated area. For the transition period, at least we would say apply it to all schools based on their size. But then you need to have those policy conversations about who's necessarily small that we were just talking about. Is it you're geographically isolated? Is it you have 2 schools nearby, but to your point, they can't house the other students, so they are necessarily small until in absence of other buildings. So something to think about there. District scale and sparsity, you have an adjustment for sparsity now. We would recommend the chicken move in this area and keep a bit of the adjustment absent further study. We are not recommending an adjustment for district scale at this point, though, with the assumption that the other piece of the policy proposal was to change your governance scale to a level that's more than the 4,000 students that the Pike is not in report set as their efficiency point. If you did a different governance structure that wasn't at that efficiency point, then you would also need to address your district cost size, because it's more costly to run smaller districts than districts over 4,000. So that is in a nutshell where we're going. So that, as I think about kind of peeling the onion, we've got the really big picture.
Okay.
Now this is a little closer, and then it'll get more regular.
Okay.
It was a lot, right? You got the.
Yes, it's a lot, and we're used to dealing in numbers.
Yeah.
But essentially, you're saying we could do a lot more for students in personnel if we went where possible to a larger system. And we'll get economies of scale, which outside of Chittenden County, I don't think we get much of any of. But we have an issue with a lot of schools that were built to hold maybe 200 students, and now they're holding 120, but they don't have the capacity to take in the school 2 miles down the road that have 100 students. And so if we're going, and that's going to really limit the amount of consolidation we can do, even if everybody wants to, which is very unlikely.
I think
But
that's
if
in part why we separated a bit that governance scale change
Yes.
perhaps from school scale that might be a longer term.
It's going to be longer, and I think we're going to have to find some way to help finance that, because a lot of the schools we have are also in need of significant repair. And facing that, it might be better to put an addition on one than to repair 2 old. But probably not built to the highest quality standards, because we're always being driven by the dollar. And we know we've got some contamination issues. So it's gonna be an interesting year. Fortunately, a lot of the policy is gonna be dealt with at the other end of the hall. But we are gonna have to stay in close contact with them and find a way to put dollars to change it. And and build a more sustainable system. Standing that no matter what we do, half the people will hate us.
Very good. Half people already hate you.
Well, then you're gonna be 100%. Must be a really good legislature will have the people I need. Okay, committee, I think our brains are into overload.
Where's the movie?
Yes, we do have a vote to do. And Senator Brock sent out an email question, and we have on.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So thank you, everyone.
And so next week, I think we've got your request. So you want to do, I just need to tell Amanda. So you want to do one session where we like really look at the base and the number and basically Yeah, what you got here, but with all the detail.
Yeah, with the numbers, we're trying, and I think what I'd like to come out with next week or the week after, depending on how long it takes us, is a list of what we need to know, what we
Yeah.
know, what we don't know.
Yeah.
I need to be able to give enough information to joint fiscal so they can
Yeah.
crunch numbers for us,
Yeah.
the tax or whoever.
Yeah.
Usually it's both of them.
And they've been, they're meeting. Yeah, so JFO, APA and tax
Yeah.
have been meeting and will continue to do so. I think that once everybody gets like, okay, your math, not just my math and that math, then it's just like
Life is good.
as we make that policy change, everybody can run the numbers.
Okay.
As we make another
And
one,
once
so.
we get numbers, then we can start the. Can we afford it?
Yeah.
And if we can't, what can we alter?
Yeah, exactly.
What's gonna be the taxes next year? What do we?
And we'll
How do we
also,
phase it in?
Yeah.
And I understand that you also are gonna have a new system for the budgeting cycle
Yeah.
and.
so we have sort of a timeline for like when we get the switch and what are the implications. And I think that we can be really explicit about like where, you know, we have policy recommendations and the modeling's been all done. And then we also have like, here's a policy consideration and we are not walking in the door saying like, we're doing this and here's all the modeling, but here's our principles for how we're thinking about this. And then we come to a consensus.
Because the number you're gonna give us are based on going to at least this larger government
Yes.
structure.
Yes,
Okay,
you've got it.
so if we
Right.
monkey with that, we monkey with the numbers.
And I
Yeah.
think that Vermont education, a chicken that sometimes moves is actually a great t-shirt. It's not as good as Wyoming's like Montana Unite, the future is here, but I think it's very Vermont. Chicken that moves.
Chicken is sometime.
All right.
The cow that lays eggs.
Thank you all.
All right, thank you all. You've been doing a lot of work on this.
Yes.
All right, committee, we have a copy. We sent an email because of concerns that were raised by public testimony. Asking, if our candidate was receiving remuneration money from any of his former, other than the state employers. He has sent us his entire financial disclosure, which this is for executive officers, sheriffs, and ethics commission members. It's very similar to the one that we all fill out. And
Just receiving some pay from Belco, that to me then is not enough to cause concern for me to be appointed to this, only because this is a public role and if people raise concerns in the future, he will still be scrutinized through his service in it. And he also says that none of his actions are contingent upon anything that he might do for Belco. So I'm still fine with him. I think he understands the system. But I think these were valid concerns to be raised, and that's why we go through this public process.
deferred compensation.
That's not an unusual situation either for anyone who worked for almost any corporation in executive capacity for a period of time to have some non-contingent compensation trail, particularly if it's a retirement piece or.
What does non-contingent mean?
It means that he doesn't have to do anything in order to earn the money, to do anything or not do anything. in order
We
to-
can get deferred compensation here. You can defer getting paid until you're retired. You can want your payment from here to for your grocery bill.
No, it's not contingent for him continuing to do things on behalf of the entity. He gets it whether he does or does not.
Well, I think more, this was submitted to the ethics commission, so whose job it is to decide if it's an ethical issue.
No,
No, I
that's
don't think
actually
so.
not true.
I think
That's
all
not-
they
this
do
just
is a
public
report
disclosure.
collection.
Yeah, they just collect.
Activity is told unless there's a
Yeah.
complaint.
Yes, exactly. They're reactive. If somebody files a complaint,
But
they
for
can
this,
open an
anybody,
investigation, but only if there's something to investigate, and this, they don't do it based on these forms at all.
I think I would be obviously more concerned if he had some sort of a trail where he was continuing to receive compensation for work that he did or might do on behalf of the entity.
Yeah.
The fact that this is separate and structured in a way that's not the case. I think it's very common for people who are executives for companies.
I assume there are tax
corporations,
benefits to do this.
To have a compensation package.
Can we just-
that includes-
Can we just delay this? Because I just got this to
Yeah.
look at, and I'd like to find out a little bit more
No, you
information.
can delay it.
And just,
And we could, I would say you could check with the Secretary of the Senate and say, who runs our ethics thing, and say, if this were senator, would there be a concern? I mean, or
Well-
with legal counsel, but just to check and see if we should be concerned.
I think it's a different position that he's,
Yes.
you know, I mean, he's basically, you know, running a regulatory agency in a lot of ways, and so regulating the
Yeah, authority.
entities. Yeah,
Yeah,
he
he does have the-
us individually, we don't really have that much authority. But, so I just want to actually think about it because we
Okay.
just got this. and
No,
Okay.
we're not
Thank you.
pushing anything through.
Mhm.
Okay, that'll give us all a chance to
On Federal
read
level,
it.
for example,
Yeah.
would this constitute any sort of conflict? I don't believe it would, but just an interesting question.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just not as familiar with this kind of conversation, so I've forgotten it myself, so.
We don't get get that here?
No.
There's no time pressure,
Right.
right? We can take the whole
Are
session.
we done?
Yeah.
Yeah,
You
he's doing a
continue
job.
to serve.
So I think.
I mean, you've got appointments from governors who are no longer governors to do.
Are we done?
We are done.
Do you want to go live?
Yeah, we can go offline.
Let's switch the camera.
I like